married Dofia Blanca, but had no children, so the Pope granted him permission to marry a second wife. But the condition was that if she, too, had no children, he must go back to only his first wife. See Henry VIII, page 207. A similar decree by Pope Gregory II was given in 726 AD. Durand said that polygamy was practiced by the rich till the 13th century. Story of Civil. 4505. This was a typical pattern throughout most nations. During the first 15 centuries of Catholicism, there were some in the church who favored plural marriages. Two of the principal reasons were, 1, because there were so many wars that left a surplus of women, and 2, the Christian soldiers and missionaries traveled into the heathen nations and saw firsthand the exemplary and beneficial merits of such a practice. If there ever was a time to consider a law permitting plural marriage, it is because of the disorder caused by war. For many centuries the Catholic Church continually considered and reconsidered this issue. Cairncross reported. But, if there was disagreement as to the natural justification of polygamy in natural law, there was general agreement that, should the male population be decimated by wars or the plague, the Pope, after a special revelation from God, could sanction the temporary introduction of polygamy to replenish the earth. Duns Scotus and the Summa Angelica are two of the many authorities giving this ruling. After polygamy was made a sin, page 59. Shabazz reviewed some examples of polygamy in the Catholic Church. The early church fathers permitted polygamy. In the 6th century, Diarmait, king of Ireland, had 2 wives and 2 concubines. Charles the Great had 2 wives and many concubines. In 1650, soon after the Peace of Westphalia, when the population had been greatly reduced by the 30 Years' War, the Frankish Kreistag at Nuremberg passed the resolution that thenceforth every man should be allowed to marry 2 women. King Constantine and his successors all had more than 1 wife. All this is attested by history. Polygamy, a remedy or a right, page 3. Catholic Charles V, King of France, 1500–1558, not only imposed monogamy on the people, but made polygamy a capital offense. Yet those who had committed adultery or whoredom were usually released and set free. At the 24th session of the Council of Trent in 1563, the subject of polygamy was one of the principal subjects for consideration. It was determined at this time that the Catholic rule of the whole Church, in all nations, would allow only monogamous marriages. This ruling would mean that all polygamists who were converted to the faith must divest himself of all plural wives. This became a serious detriment to Catholic conversions in every polygamous nation, and many who would have been converts refused to join because of this restriction. When Catholic missionaries taught Akbar, the great Mughal and follower of Muhammad, he was ready to accept Christianity until he was told to give up his harem. He thought more of plural marriage than he did of Catholicism. All this caused a rise to many writings defending polygamy. The subject is still an issue of debate among many Catholic missionaries and priests. The Protestant Reformation forced the Catholic Church to define its doctrines and to undertake the ecclesiastical reforms that have long been debated. American People's Inc. 621. All of their doctrines, ordinances and beliefs, including the anti-polygamy stand, were brought to the forefront and have been generally accepted ever since. These were ratified by the Church in 1564. Between 1530 and 1580 the pressure against plural marriage grew more dramatically throughout the Catholic world. One of the final and decisive factors was attributed to Abd Tosi, who in 1676 compiled a large 2-volume rebuttal against polygamy. His observations came from the Arabs and Turks, and so he concluded it should not be practiced among Christians. His work, entitled History of the East, still stands as an orthodox view of church policy, and it lists 4 major reasons for marriage. 1. Procreation of children. 2. Comfort and mutual help. 3. Tempering of lust. 4. A symbol of Christ to the Church. He fails to point out that each of these purposes can also be achieved in plural marriage, but are unavailable to those women who can't find an unmarried monogamous man. Philosophers, civil officers and leading Catholic Church men have failed to solve the problem and plight of their surplus women. They seek every possible justification for monogamy at the sacrifice of the widows, spinsters, and other single women in their society. Chapter 12. The Munsters defended polygamy with their lives. Of the several different polygamous advocates in societies, none has proved as unusual and interesting as that of John Bochelson, John of Leyden, and his Anabaptist followers in Munster, Germany, during the mid-1500s. Anabaptists was the name given to those who denied the validity of infant baptism, among other things, and were the extreme left in the army of the Reformers. John Bochelson was born an illegitimate son of the mayor in a small Dutch town near Leyden, Holland. He was trained as a tailor, but soon ventured into other fields. He became restless and traveled throughout Europe and later spent 4 years in England. He loved poetry and acting, and soon found his gift as an eloquent orator. His success came quickly when he became a preacher in the Anabaptist movement that was spreading across Holland in 1533. The leader of this new revival was Jan Matthey, who selected John for a mission to Munster, Germany, to convert the town from other Protestants and Catholics. John did just that. His success was phenomenal, and the town was soon converted to the Anabaptists. The Catholics and Protestants were at war, and John had a revelation showing him that his leader, Jan Matthey, would be killed. This prophecy was fulfilled shortly afterwards, on Easter Day, April 4th. Thus John became the new religious, political and military leader of the Munster community, and he declared himself king of the New Zion. Within 2 months his little fortress consisted of 15,000 people, and when Munster was assaulted by a military force, John led his people to victory. But the male population in Munster had diminished until there were 4 women to every man. About this time John announced that he had received a revelation to live plural marriage, that the ancient prophets lived it without condemnation from God, and that it would now be legal and acceptable in their community. The new doctrine raised a storm of opposition, but John said the revelation is damnation of those who refuse to accept it, and threatened his opponents with excommunication. John quoted extensively from the Old Testament, showing that God approved of it, and from a community that lived by the Bible, literally interpreted, the case for polygamy had been made. See after polygamy was made a sin, Cairncross, page 8. The people of Munster suffered from many hardships such as war, poverty and social upheavals, but then came polygamy. Which was not introduced without some sanguinary opposition, and did not probably extend far beyond the circle of Bochelson and the leaders of the movement. These eccentricities were regarded by their authors as a necessary preparation for the second coming of Christ. Cambridge Modern History, 226. During the 1520s there had been several religious leaders who had periodically advocated plural marriage. They appeared in different areas of Germany, but none gained the notoriety of the little colony of Anabaptists in Munster. The pages of German history have always been filled with the devastations of war, and naturally wars produce a surplus of women. That surplus usually creates 2 possible options: prostitution or polygamy. It was shortly after this critical time that Bochelson claimed to have had his vision from the Lord telling him and his followers to live plural marriage. The announcement of this controversial doctrine was made in July of 1534, and the whole community assembled in the cathedral square where polygamy was debated for hours. The majority finally concluded that it was a Bible practice sanctioned by God, and, not too surprisingly, no men protested against it. So much for the men. But the women might logically have denounced a trend which would put them in their place. Far from it. From the outset, they played a crucial role in the Anabaptist movement, in Munster and elsewhere. Key to a higher emotional pitch, women are seldom absent from a mystic or revivalist explosion, especially when there is an appeal to the spirit of self-sacrifice. Even before Mattheys took over, they readily responded to the propaganda urging them to sell all they had and renounce the things of this world. They divested themselves of their rings, gold, studded girdles and other jewelry. After polygamy was made a sin, Cairncross, page 9. Thus, in a comparatively short time, the town had solidified and unitedly proclaimed that it was a revelation given to a righteous man. A complete and accurate account of this strange society of polygamists of Munster, Germany, is difficult to locate because all that remains are small portions of rare manuscripts and a few short writings by those who were prejudiced against them. One statement from an apostate comes from a Mr. Gresbeck, who described polygamy in the town in the following manner. There was fierce resentment in the town among the women where 2 or 3 of them lived together and shared a husband. There was no end to the abuse and bickering among them. For the first wife always wished to be closest to her husband, and so did the new wives. Thus, they could not get along together, and there was never any peace. Complaints streamed in every day to the prophets, the preachers and the 12 elders. At first, the authorities put the refractory wives in prison. But in vain. Then Rotman brandished the much graver threat of the sword which cowed them for a time. The rebaptism of Munster, K. Loeffler, page 116. And another account reads, Bochelt, better known in history as John of Leyden, was now supreme. Giving himself out as the successor of David, he claimed royal honors and absolute power in the New Zion. He justified the most arbitrary and extravagant measures by the authority of visions from heaven, as others have done in similar circumstances. With this pretended sanction he legalized polygamy, and himself took 4 wives, one of whom he beheaded with his own hand in the marketplace in a fit of frenzy. As a natural consequence of such license, Munster was for 12 months a scene of unbridled profligacy. Enc. Britannica, 1936 ed. 1/858. These biased accounts, however, were not supported by others who recorded a more peaceful homestyle among these polygamists. Polygamy is oftentimes used as an excuse for the lustful nature of men, but this apparently was not true of the Munsterites. Cairncroft concurred. Nor was it even a question, in theory at least, of the men satisfying their sexual drive. The Anabaptists claimed on the contrary that they were eliminating lust and thus returning to the state of sinlessness obtained before the fall. Not for nothing is the main doctrinal writing of the Munsterites, by Rotman, called The Restitution, for its subject is precisely the restitution of all things to the original purity of Eden, before corruption entered the world. The aim of marriage, he wrote, is to beget children who will praise God for all eternity. Husband and wife marry to live according to God's love, in order to beget children, and for no other reason. Only for this purpose did God create man and woman and unite them. This document is the first known apology for polygamy in Europe. When therefore such constant emphasis was laid on the need to increase the population, John and his colleagues were not simply following Luther's anti-celibacy line, but, the key words, the principle that the world should be increased, for God wanted to set up a new world with his people. The most rapid increase in the number of children conceived without sin in the New Jerusalem was an integral part of the Anabaptists' millennial beliefs. Matthew's master, Hoffman, predicted that the advent of the New Jerusalem would be hastened if the elect could conceive without sin, in covenantal purity, as before the fall, the 144,000 who were to be sealed, according to one of the favorite texts of the millennialists. Revelation 7:4. And Rotman, in a sermon in Munster Cathedral, proclaimed that the saints should multiply as the sands of the sea. After polygamy was made a sin, pages 26 to 27. So this polygamous community was not a city of orgies, as many may have supposed, but one which attempted to live plurality with morality. One author of this history stated that sexual behavior was at first regulated strictly in a severely puritanical morality. The Pursuit of the Millennium, N. Cohn, page 292, Cairncroft agreed. In fact, Munster under Anabaptist rule, far from being the scene of wild orgies, was throughout a center of extremely austere morality. Its only crime, in the sexual field by Orthodox standards, was to have introduced polygamy, and a highly Puritan type at that. After polygamy was made a sin, page 24. Divorce was granted on the basis of 3 reasons. If the woman was forced to marry, if the man was impotent, or if the husband was an unbeliever. A woman with 2 husbands was put to death. One man who lived for wine and women was put to death. Even adultery and fornication were capital crimes. The Munster standard of morality also advocated that men should not have intercourse with their wives while pregnant or menstruating. A barren woman was grounds for a man to take another wife. Many of their moral beliefs were substantiated in the books of the Bible. As king, John Bochelson proceeded to institute parades, parties, banquets, theatrical performances, and exciting dances, especially loved by the women. He fashioned a table on which he wrote the queen's names in order of precedence. John ultimately had 16 wives, but they were not very prolific as apparently he had only 2 children. In the beginning there was considerable opposition by the first wives to this new practice of plural marriage, but later many of them became the strongest advocates. It was recorded that the plural wives did much of the recruiting for new wives for their husbands just as Sarah did for Abraham. There was even a type of honor and distinction that came to a man because of the number of wives he had. On one occasion a particular preacher went around the tables asking the brethren how many wives each had. One man responded that he had 4, whereupon the preacher said, "God be praised. Take precedence over me, for I have only 3. The Rebaptism of Munster, K. Loeffler, page 159. The doctrine of plural marriage became as deeply planted into the minds and hearts of this people as it ever was with the Mormons. Cairncroft stated, "There is no evidence of any serious opposition to polygamy on the part of the first wives and all the wives. Gave the men strong backing in the defense of the town. Had there been any extensive opposition to the new form of marriage, it is clear that this would have been reported. After polygamy was made a sin, page 16. Wives became good friends, and the second wives were stronger and happier, because they were getting a husband that they may not have had otherwise. News of the Munster community traveled fast, and finally Prince Philip of Hesse entered the town and reproached the citizens for their views on marriage. Ironically, the prince would later be the talk of the nation for taking a second wife himself. About this time, Luther proclaimed freedom for Catholic nuns to marry because their convents were a mere prison of virginity. This, too, caused a new surplus of women eligible for polygamy. It was a strange thing because it was the women who began the thrust for their rights of choosing husbands married or not. Cairncross explained. But the Anabaptists' trump card in obtaining the women's support was the crude mathematical fact that, in February 1534, there were at the very least 3 women of marriageable age to 1 man, and by October, the proportion may well have risen to 4, or even 5, to 1. In the chaos that followed the sectarians' assumption of power, many of the male unbelievers were driven out, but left their wives behind to look after their businesses, in the expectation that they, the men, would soon be back. Conversely, streams of sympathizers swept into the New Jerusalem, sometimes husbands without wives, but more often wives whose husbands had been killed or abandoned as infidels. Given the proportion of the sexes, the pressure for polygamy was bound to be almost irresistible, quite apart from doctrinal incentives. Many a woman, as a Catholic historian of the revolt has pointed out, preferred to share a husband than have none at all. Ibid. Page 11. Men were advocating plural marriage from a biblical and doctrinal standpoint, but it was generally being accepted more from practicality than because of doctrine. Marriage was a new opportunity for many of the nuns in the convents, and they were anxious to take advantage of it. Cairncross stated. A week later, the nuns from another, a second, convent abandoned the veil on the pretext of producing offspring, and pressed to be allowed to endure the yoke of marriage. Nor did the enthusiasm of the women slack when polygamy was introduced. On the contrary, it was they who brought up the guns to batter in the doors of the town hall, where the rebels against the new form of marriage had dug themselves in. Ibid. Page 11. Then Cairncross added, given the proportion of the sexes, the pressure for polygamy was bound to be almost irresistible, quite apart from doctrinal incentives. Ibid. Page 11. A flood of women were available because of the Catholic-Protestant wars, and some men were so eager to take more wives that certain restrictions had to be placed on them. The historian Gresbeck commented that when a woman did not get a confirmation of a marriage proposal, the man usually did. Some young girls, too young, became the victims of this mad dash to acquire wives. A proper and wise rule was adopted that a lady had the privilege of choosing her own husband. The Catholics and Protestants had seriously clashed on doctrine until it became a clash of arms. The Peasants' Revolt of the 20s was actually a revolutionary war. These Christians who believed in praying for their enemies and turning the other cheek, put aside their religion to baptize each other in their own blood. The Protestants thought the Catholics were heathen apostates, and the Catholics thought the Protestants were the heathen apostates. Actually, they were both right. However, when they saw the people of Munster adopt the practice of polygamy, they felt a worse enemy had arisen. They believed such a system might be contagious and would put an end to their craft. So these two bitter enemies made peace with each other and united to destroy the polygamists. The news of polygamy in Munster aroused panic in all of Germany and created terror among the Christians. Their solution was to create another war, and every polygamist that was captured was tortured, turned on the wheel, burned, drowned, stabbed or beheaded. It was a new era in which the lives of Abraham, Jacob, Moses, Gideon and many other prophets would have been in mortal danger from the Christians. The reports of this religious order defending themselves reads like a masterpiece of military victories. The idea of preparing for the Second Advent gave the movement its strength and stimulated the revolutionists of Munster to resist for a year and a half the miseries of a siege and all the forces which Germany could bring against them. The Cambridge Modern History, 226. Since Munster was a town of 15,000 inhabitants with only 1,500 able to bear arms of warfare, it was amazing that they could hold out against much greater forces. It would have taken uncommon cooperation, organization and determination to make such a defense of their homes, families and beliefs. Both men and women defended their polygamous faith with their lives. But unfortunately, this grandstand program was short-lived. About a year after it started, it was doomed. In January 1535 their persecutors sealed off the town from the outside world, and provisions were cut off. Starvation set in. Some escaped and others were captured. On June 24, 1535, the attackers forced entry into the town. The overwhelming odds against them soon reduced their defense force to only 300 able-bodied men. This small remnant decided to surrender rather than have their wives and children all massacred. The Christian victors took all 300 captives outside the city and killed them off one by one. Devara, John Bochelson's second wife, was told to recant her beliefs, and when she refused, they beheaded her. John himself was captured, paraded around, and exhibited like a strange animal, as the man who had so many wives. Then they tortured him, trying to force him to deny his revelation on polygamy, but he would not give in. He said he had probably offended man, but not God in that belief, and that better several wives than several whores. He pleaded, "Let God be judge between us," but they wouldn't allow that. He was tied to a stake with Nepertlinkind, another rebel leader, and tortured to death with red-hot tongs, amidst the rejoicing and applause of the Catholic audience, as a Lutheran eyewitness recorded uneasily. John endured his ordeal with heroic fortitude, without a sound and not a movement, until he was dead. After polygamy was made a sin, Cairncross, page 21. It was said that his persecutors had demanded that he deny his revelation on plural marriage, but with every jab of a hot poker, he refused to tell them what they demanded. Without ever denying his revelation and in the midst of severe pain and suffering, he expired faithful to the end to his conviction of plural marriage. Thus passed a people with a principle. Their enemies were too heathenish to live it, and they didn't want anyone else living it either. From triumph to tragedy, from heaven to hell, that little band of people defended the doctrine of plural marriage to the bitter end. Tragically, similar sacrifices were recorded in history 300 years later among the Latter-day Saints. The Anabaptists had gained an enormous following and threatened to supplant the other churches, especially in the Rhine Valley and in the Netherlands. Because of their views, they were branded by Catholics and Protestants alike as heretical and seditious. Ultimately, the death penalty was imposed upon all Anabaptists throughout the empire with Lutheran concurrence. In Germany, the Anabaptists were exterminated or expelled. They survive elsewhere, however, as Mennonites and Hutterian Brethren. American Peoples Inc. 15487. Even though the Anabaptists in the Munster community were quite radical and different in many ways from the early Latter-day Saints of 300 years later, there are some striking similarities that are interesting to note. John Leyden took his plural wife exactly 300 years before the time that Joseph Smith took his. John proclaimed his society was the beginning of a restitution of sound Christian doctrine. Joseph claimed a restoration of it. John advocated he was preparing the people for the coming of the millennium and establishing a new Jerusalem. Joseph tried to do the same. John considered his people the elect and advocated their gathering together for protection from the destructions to come. So did Joseph. John attempted a program of unity of their temporal means so there would be no poor among them. Joseph attempted to establish a united order for the same purpose. John introduced a program to have everyone rebaptized, just as Joseph did. John's followers were from the poorer class of people who believed in puritanical sexual morals with the purpose of having large families, just as with Joseph Smith and his followers. John taught the members to have faith, works in the Holy Spirit so they could receive the gifts of dreams, visions and revelation. So did Joseph. John said he was establishing a theocracy that should gradually spread to all communities and nations. Joseph did the same. John ordained men to the office of kings and women as queens just as Joseph did. John received a revelation supporting the doctrine of plural marriage. And so did Joseph. John wrote and adopted 12 articles of their faith. Joseph wrote 13. John was considered and hailed as a prophet, just as was Joseph. John believed in a temple of the Lord, and so did Joseph. John had 12 apostles for the ruling ministry of their church, just as Joseph did. John believed that as a religious leader, he should be a prophet for the people and should receive revelation, just as the prophet Joseph did. John and his people received persecution from the Catholics and Protestants, just as Joseph did. John supported the idea that a new Jerusalem would be built other than at Palestine, so did Joseph. John knew that his life and the lives of his followers were in danger from the Christians, so he formed a military force with himself as commander-in-chief. So did Joseph as commander of the Noble Legion. John was persecuted and tortured by his Christian enemies and finally became a martyr to his faith, and so was Joseph Smith. After completing the job of killing off the polygamists, the Catholics and Protestants went back to making war against each other. These continual attacks intensified until they developed into what was known as the 30-Year War. It was a strange name for a warfare that actually existed for centuries. Nations were involved, and through the centuries their religion included new and better tactics for killing each other by the technical advancement of military power and machines. World War I and II both display the same spirit in which Christian brothers sent each other to heaven by gunpowder and steel. But in spite of their differences, history has shown that they will once again make a peaceful alliance to kill polygamists. Chapter 13. The Reformers. Polygamy more secret than public. The Reformation supposedly started about 1517, but many men before then had preached, written and given their lives in support of a reform in the Catholic Church. The Reformation caused a split in the Church because of their many changed and perverted doctrines. Besides all their errors in doctrine, history, and ordinances, the Church had ventured into money-making programs to gain greater wealth. The popes received and wallowed in more riches than kings and emperors. The Pope was especially engaged in two expensive programs. One was sending out troops to fight his wars in foreign lands, the other was his plans to build the great St. Peter's Basilica. In order to acquire the necessary wealth to accomplish his purposes, the Pope sent out men with indulgences, which could be bought in exchange for forgiveness of sins. Repentance was not necessary. These bargains in salvation could even be bought for sins that might be committed in the future. Salvation was much easier to buy than to earn. The Pope was pleased, too, because with this program, immense income poured into Rome's treasury. The wealth of the popes was best depicted by two artist preachers. They painted two large pictures on the wall of a building in full view of the public. One was a picture of Christ, meek and poor, tattered clothes and bare feet riding into Jerusalem on a donkey. The other was of the Pope in a pontifical procession with rich robes, triple crown of gold and a dazzling array, preceded by a parade of trumpeters. This was an obvious ermine in paint. Morality of the Catholic clergy had sunk to a new low. It has been acknowledged that Pope Gregory VII introduced a clerical celibacy that was legally imposed, but the outcome was often clerical concubinage. American People's Inc. 15485, when Luther made his pilgrimage to Rome, he prostrated himself on the earth and exclaimed, "Holy Rome, I salute thee," but everywhere he looked he saw things that filled him with disgust and horror. No one can imagine what sins and infamous actions are committed in Rome, they must be seen and heard to be believed. Thus they are in the habit of saying, if there is a hell, Rome is built over it, it is an abyss whence issues every kind of sin. The Great Controversy, E.G. White, page 143. Luther expressed it even stronger when he said there were more devils in Rome than tiles on the rooftops. Another vice that had troubled the members of the Catholic Church was the declared infallibility of the Pope. Members were told to put all confidence in him, regardless of true principles, preachings, the scriptures, or the Spirit of God. The doctrines of the Church and the practices of its leaders were taking two different directions. Such conditions were clearly noticed by lay members of the Church. Even the Church hierarchy began to run into conflicts with their religion. It finally resulted in the Church having two different popes. And if this weren't enough, to settle the conflict, another pope rose to the throne. The papacy was shaken. The following sections in this chapter will discuss the Reformation roles played by known polygamists or advocates, such as Martin Luther, King Philip of Hesse, King Henry of England, John Lacer, Martin Maiden, Napoleon Bonaparte, Arthur Schopenhauer, and James Campbell. Martin Luther. The problems within the Catholic Church came to the ears and hearts of many priests. Good men such as Wycliffe, Huss, Jerome, Cathari, Walden and Zwingli were all deeply moved to make appeals for sensible reforms. Another active voice of the Reformation was Martin Luther, who posted 95 theses on a chapel door, requesting a discussion among the more learned members of his local parish. What he thought might be a problem-solving local discussion turned into an uproar that swept all over Europe. This little monk caused the Reformation to gain terrific momentum all because he renounced the sale of indulgences and the infallibility of the Pope. Luther was soon contacted by the papacy, but reconciliation became impossible. The Church burned Luther's tracts, Luther burned theirs. The Pope wrote repudiations against Luther, Luther wrote repudiations against him. Many of Luther's tracts against the corrupt doctrines of the Catholic Church are still published. A variety of doctrines arose in heated debates, among which were indulgences, purgatory, sacraments, baptism, the Lord's Supper, penance, Mass, confession, monasticism, and of course the one they didn't want mentioned, polygamy. Luther was excommunicated at Worms, Germany, in 1521, which was just 13 years before the polygamous uprising in Munster. As a priest, he had had a concourse of people coming to him for help with their marriages. Monogamy produced a multitude of problems, as Luther explained. 'Tis a grand thing for a married pair to live in perfect union, but the devil rarely permits this. When they are apart, they cannot endure the separation, and when they are together, they cannot endure the always seeing one another. 'Tis as the poet says, nec tecum vivier possum, nec sine te. Married people must assiduously pray against these assaults of the devil. I have seen marriages where, at first, husband and wife seemed as though they would eat one another up. In 6 months they have separated in mutual disgust. 'Tis the devil inspires this evanescent ardor, in order to divert the parties from prayer. Table Talk, Luther, page 301. If monogamy had many problems, polygamy certainly had more, but celibacy was the worst of the three. Yet this was the lifestyle the Catholic Church was insisting on for its priests, nuns and monks. The consequences were catastrophic. Saint Ulrich, Bishop of Augsburg, related a fearful thing that befell at Rome. Pope Gregory, who confirmed celibacy, ordered a fish pond at Rome, had by a convent of nuns, to be cleared out. The water being let off, there were found at the bottom more than 6,000 skulls of children, babies, that had been cast into the pond and drowned. Such were the fruits of enforced celibacy. Hereupon Pope Gregory abolished celibacy, but the popes who succeeded him re-established it. In our own time, there was in Austria, at Neuburg, a convent of nuns who, by reason of their licentious doings, were removed from it and placed elsewhere, and their convent filled with Franciscans. These monks, wishing to enlarge the building, foundations were dug, and in excavating, there were found 12 great pots, in each of which was the carcass of an infant. How much better to let these people marry, than, by prohibition thereof, to cause the murder of so many innocent creatures. Table Talk, Luther, page 307. Celibacy had infiltrated the Catholic Church as early as the 1st century AD. Learned philosophers such as Simon Magus, Manoah, and Cerinthus had studied at Alexandria and were later converted to Christianity, but brought some of their Gnostic and celibate ideals with them. Other Gnostic Christians such as Valentine, Montanus, Tertullian, and Origen also advocated celibacy. By the 2nd century it was one of the prevailing doctrines, and by the 3rd century it had permanently corrupted the Church. It was Bardesanes who wrote in 170 AD that the disciples of Christ would live closer to God if they renounce wedlock, abstain from animal food, and live in solitude on the slightest and most meager diet. See History of the Roman Empire, Cately, pt. 2, chap. 7. Origen, 185 to 253 AD, the celebrated and prolific ecclesiastical writer from Alexandria, was so strongly convinced of celibacy that he voluntarily was castrated. By the 4th century a sect called the Severians thought that woman was the work of Satan and marriage was diabolical. This idea, of course, soon led to their own extinction. Luther questioned many doctrines of the Catholic Church, and celibacy was one of them. He soon brought about a full exposure of what horrid deeds followed the nuns, monks, and priests in their cloisters and monasteries. Luther cried out, "Would to God that I could thus rescue all captive consciences and empty all the cloisters." Hist. Of the Reformation, D.H. Digbean, 3241, the breach had already started, and Luther was soon able to assist the numerous nuns and monks in their liberation. In 1524 Luther laid aside the frock of the friars and strongly encouraged the celibate nuns and monks to enter into domestic family life. He himself married a former nun, Catherine von Bora. Luther saw celibacy as one of the works of men and not of God, and declared that it is not good that man should be alone. Gen. 2:18. His marriage created more commotion than an earthquake, but Luther considered anything offensive to the world must be inoffensive to God. Another problem arose when so many nuns were available for marriage. In fact, there were too many. Again the discussion of plural marriage arose and could not be dampened. It soon broke out in Munster, among kings, and even with the lay members of the churches. Books and pamphlets both for and against polygamy were sent all over Germany, one of which came into the hands of Luther and his friends. When asked about it, Luther gave it serious thought. It was mentioned at table that a book had just been published, setting forth the apology of bigamy. The doctor for a while remained silent and seemed plunged in grave reverie. At length he said, "I have often wondered at the king of Arabia having 700 wives." Someone observed, "Sir Doctor, what say you to Solomon, who had 300 wives or queens and 700 concubines?" The text, moreover, adding that the number of young girls at his court had not been reckoned up. The doctor replied, "'Tis to be kept in mind that the list of queens in Scripture comprehends the royal family of David, who were supported by his son." The Elector of Saxony has a great number of ladies at his court, princesses, noble damsels, women of honor, maids of honor, women of the bedchamber, and what not, but it does not follow that these are all his wives. As to Solomon's having entertained all these women as his wives, 'tis out of the question, impracticable. Someone asked, did Solomon perform penitence? Luther replied, no, but the scripture tells us he slept with his father, wherefore, I conclude he was admitted to beatitude, such being the meaning of that expression, which is not employed with reference to Absalom. Scotus has formerly damned Solomon. Table Talk, page 301. The Catholic Church qualified those for church offices according to their moral standards, and polygamy or bigamy were among the worst kinds of moral sins. The Pope considered a man who had 2 wives, either consecutively or at the same time, to be a bigamist. Martin Luther criticized the Pope for such a stand. Scripture uses the term bigamist for one who, like Lamech, has 2 wives living at the same time, Gen. 4:19. The Pope, however, is more learned and calls one who marries 2 women successively a bigamist. They are not allowed to preach, baptize, administer the sacrament, or hold any office in the church, even if they were holier than St. John and their wives holier than the Mother of God. So marvelously holy is the Pope in his decretals. However, if someone had ravished 100 virgins, violated 100 honorable widows, and lain with 100 whores before that, he may become not only pastor or preacher, but also bishop or pope. And even if he were to continue this kind of life, he would nonetheless be tolerated in those offices. But if he marries a bride who is a virgin, or a make-believe virgin, he cannot be a servant of God. It makes no difference that he is a true Christian, learned, pious, competent. He is a bigamist, thus, he must leave his office and never return to it. What do you think of that? Is that not a higher holiness than that of Christ himself, together with that of the Holy Spirit and his church? Christ spurns neither men with 1 wife or 2 successive wives, nor women with 1 husband or 2 successive husbands, if they believe in him. He lets them remain members of his holy Christian people. He also makes use of them for whatever work they are adapted. Selected writings of Martin Luther, T.G. Tappert, 4,349. Luther was also critical of the church rule that stated if a man should marry a woman who was not a virgin, then he was a bigamist and therefore not worthy of any office in the church. I truly believe that in accordance with their wisdom, no man could marry a virgin and, after her death, become a priest among them, for who can guarantee or vouch that he is actually getting a virgin? The road runs past the door, as they say. Now if he would find her not a virgin and that is a chance he must take, he would, through no fault of his own, be a stinking bigamist. And if he wants to be certain that he can become a priest, he dare not marry a virgin either, for what assurance does he have that she is one? However, he may ravish virgins, widows, and wives, have many whores, commit all sorts of secret sins, he is still worthy of the priestly office. The sum and substance of it all is that the Pope, the devil, and his church are averse to the estate of matrimony. Therefore do not worry, as was said, about the papists' talk concerning the personal qualifications for an ecclesiastical office, for these asses do not understand St. Paul's words, nor do they know what St. Paul's language calls a sacrament. Ibid. 4,355. At Wittenberg as early as 1522, Luther gave a sermon in which he mentioned the plausibility of plural marriage. He was not advocating living it, but merely accepting it as a doctrinal issue. A few years later he was pressured to acknowledge it as a true doctrine that could be lived at that time. It was not from the peasant's corner that the query came, but from Prince Philip of Hesse. The king's wife could not give him a son, and so he considered a plural marriage, appealing to Luther for the biblical view of that doctrine. Luther and his wisest colleagues seriously considered it for several days, and finally wrote him the conclusion of their research. But after all, if your highness is fully resolved to marry a second wife, we judge it ought to be done secretly, as we have said with respect to the dispensation demanded on the same account, that is, that none but the person you shall wed, and a few trusty persons, know of the matter, and they, too, obliged to secrecy under the seal of confession. Hence no contradiction nor scandal of moment need be apprehended, for it is no extraordinary thing for princes to keep concubines, and though the vulgar should be scandalized thereat, the more intelligent would doubt of the truth. And prudent persons would approve of this moderate kind of life, preferable to adultery and other brutal actions. There is no need of being much concerned for what men will say, provided all goes right with conscience. So far do we approve it, and in those circumstances only by us specified, for the gospel hath neither recalled nor forbid what was permitted in the law of Moses with respect to marriage. Jesus Christ has not changed the external economy, but added justice only, and life everlasting for reward. He teaches the true way of obeying God, and endeavors to repair the corruption of nature. Your Highness hath therefore, in this writing, not only the approbation of us all, in case of necessity, concerning what you desire, but also the reflections we have made thereupon. We beseech you to weigh them, as becoming a virtuous, wise, and Christian prince. We also beg of God to direct all for his glory and your Highness's salvation. May God preserve your Highness. We are most ready to serve your Highness. Given at Wittenberg the Wednesday after the feast of St. Nicholas, 1539. Your Highness's most humble and most obedient subjects and servants. Martin Luther. Philip Melanchthon. Martin Bucer. Anthony Corvin. Adam. John Leving. Justus Winfert. Dennis Mellenther. From Hist. Of the Variations of the Protestant Churches, James Benign Bossuet, Vol. 1. King Philip of Hesse. But let's briefly review the events leading up to this response to Prince Philip. The three powerhouses that ramrodded the Reformation were Luther, Melanchthon, and Bucer, the latter being an eminent theologian, friend and advisor to King Philip, the Landgrave. Bucer was utterly horrified when he learned that his good friend, Philip, who was one of the most important offenses of the Reformation, was about to commit bigamy. Bucer rushed to Philip's castle at Mulsungen in an attempt to dissuade the prince from a terrible mistake. Bucer listened to Philip's arguments, the main one being his desire for a son to inherit the throne, and had scriptural references to justify it. Philip further stated that if the reformers wouldn't assist him, he would turn to the Catholic emperor. Bucer was stunned and took the problem to Luther. This was a matter that would take more than a day for the leading reformers to solve. Melanchthon argued that if polygamy were allowed, the enemies of the Reformation would lump them in with the Turks, Orientals and Arabs. It was obvious that if they decided in favor of Philip's request, the marriage would have to be a complete secret, which was the plan proposed. So in December 1539, polygamy was again to be lived within the boundaries of Germany. The Protestant leaders had made their Wittenberg deliberation for the sanction of plural marriage even if it was to be a secret. Philip's wife, Anna, had given her consent, but with a long list of stipulations. The new bride, Marguerite, was less informed of the wedding arrangements than her mother, yet she seemed happy with the prospects of her future. The wedding would occur March 4, 1540, in Rothenburg. Bucer and Melanchthon arrived for the ceremony. Philip issued an address to be read at that time, part of which stated, that this step is not decreed as capricious or frivolous, and no offense be caused hereby, and the good name of the said maiden and her honorable relatives be not jeopardized. His Highness swears before God that it is motivated by important and unavoidable considerations of conscience and body, and that it is impossible for him to be saved unless he takes a second wife in addition to his first one. After polygamy was made a sin, Cairncross, page 39. The ceremony was a joyous one for Philip, and he said he did it with God and a good conscience. Through his marriage to Marguerite, Philip was overjoyed to learn that he was now a brother-in-law to Martin Luther. Nonetheless, Luther's concern was that the marriage be kept secret because of the bad example it might set for others. Philip agreed and afterwards said, the marriage was a quiet one, since in our times it is unusual to have two wives at the same time. Although in the present case it is listed in Christian. Ibid. Page 39. Shortly after this event, however, the court preacher, Mellander, proclaimed plural marriage as a true and acceptable principle of the Bible. That should have been enough to let Philip off the hook, but rumors still spread about him when Marguerite had a new residence built for her. Eventually, through pressure on witnesses, the truth came out. Even a document by Bucer for and against polygamy was discovered, which added more public awareness of the doctrine. Fingers were pointed at Luther, who supported polygamy as a moral and biblical doctrine, but its practice bothered him for fear it would backfire against the Reformation. Luther's friend, Melanchthon, also felt the effects of the public pressure and began to suffer the monstrous danger and scandal that fell upon him. For days he couldn't eat or drink anything, so Luther went out to bolster him up. One wonders how Melanchthon would have reacted if it had been his own polygamous marriage. Now only about 5 years after the Munster episode, polygamy was again the subject of debate and consternation all over Germany. As rumors of polygamy spread among the Germans, there were mixed reactions: laughter, anger, hatred, and even some support, as a few deemed it a practical solution to a serious problem. To Prince Philip it was right in God's eyes and should be defended, regardless of the cost. He was prepared to stand by his convictions and lose his throne or his life if necessary. Bucer suggested that Philip's marriage contract be revised to read that he had taken a concubine, but would treat her as a wife. Even the powerful Luther seemed to quail sooner than Philip, who wrote strong letters of defense for his faith and belief in his plural marriage. He assembled all of his notables together to convince them of his stand, saying that anyone should have the right to have a plural wife if they so desired. Philip and Luther finally met head-on and thrashed it out for a period of 4 days. Luther was not denying its justification before God, only before the eyes of the world. Luther thought a public defense of polygamy would destroy the Protestant cause, but he said if the deliberation were published, he would take all the blame. How strange that even then, as now, mistresses, concubines, illegitimate children and fornications were acceptable moral behavior before the legality of plural wives. The Protestants backed away from Philip because of his plural marriage, so he withdrew from them and changed the balance of power in favor of the Catholic emperor. This change in support gave the Catholic pamphleteers ample opportunity to refute both Philip's marriages and the Protestant cause as religious mockery before God. Philip then turned to his chief theologian, Leaning, who issued pamphlets and briefs in defense of plural marriage, especially his Dialogus Neobuli, which was a dialogue between a supporter and an opponent of polygamy. His summary was that polygamy was not contrary to divine, natural, canonical or imperial law. The manuscript was given to Bucer for comments. He added a few corrections, but still tried to prevent Philip from publishing it. Philip continued to chide the reformers for their faint-heartedness and wrote to Melanchthon, "If we, you, Luther and others suffer death, yet there will be found people who are more godly and trusting than we, who will accept the solution, which is not forbidden by God and is free and permissible." Ibid. Page 47. Luther and Philip eventually patched up their differences and together pushed the Protestant cause once again. When someone said that Abraham was not a Christian because he lived polygamy, Luther shot back that he was the first Christian and he was more important than all the popes put together. Luther stated that he could not forbid such marriages, but he would not advise them either. He supported the idea that it was a matter that should be directed from God to the individual. He also declared that many polygamists were members of the early Christian church. Bucer and Melanchthon both agreed with Luther and said that plural marriages should not be denied to Christians in modern times. Bucer even wrote an extensive book supporting polygamy, which was never published until nearly 300 years later. He concluded that a Christian could live plural marriage, and it should be left to his own individual conscience. Luther's problems with Prince Philip of Hesse should have been enough to last a lifetime, but that was not the end of it. The scene extended clear to the King of England. King Henry of England. King Henry of England, 1491–1547, was married to Catherine of Aragon, who bore him several children, but only one daughter survived. She would become the future Queen Mary. Unless the king had a son, the country could be torn between the armies of rival claimants, or it might be a reason for invasion by some foreign contender. In 1526, at the age of 35, Henry looked seriously at a 19-year-old girl named Anne Boleyn as a possible prospect for a wife. This presented the problem of getting Pope Clement VII to issue a divorce from Catherine, which was not very likely. Firstly, the Pope would say it was theologically wrong, and secondly, Catherine was an aunt of Emperor Charles V, who had previously sacked and captured the Holy City of Rome. In July 1528, Henry sought to have an annulment case tried in English courts. The result was for Rome to make the final decision. Since that failed, he then sought the possibility of a bigamous marriage. In September, the Pope, strangely enough, relayed by secret message that it was in his jurisdiction to favor Henry's request for 2 wives. However, the Pope's advisors did not agree. The king then went to a noted theologian and scholar named Cardinal Cajetan, who was inclined to give permission for polygamy rather than have the king guilty of divorce or some other infraction of moral principle. Cajetan declared that polygamy was not forbidden by natural or divine law because all the marriages of the prophets and patriarchs were legitimate. He also noted that it was not forbidden in the New Testament and that Matthew 19:9 forbade divorce, not polygamy. He further stated that there is no law in the Bible commanding men to have only one wife. The cardinal's views did not set right with his colleagues, who thought they were just filthy teachings. Yet some of the theologians agreed with him. The king then sought the help of Protestant leaders for theological advice on this marriage arrangement, since it had been lived and recorded in the Bible. By 1530, the issue had become a serious matter with the Pope, who wanted to sanction polygamy for Henry, but it was too radical for his hierarchy to accept. As theological doctrine, it could be resolved, but in practice it was poison. Divorce from a first wife was easier than marriage to a second. Catholic missionaries had caused more trouble by breaking up plural marriages among the heathen converts than if they had just accepted them. In some places the Catholic missionaries were rejected because they did not accept plural marriages, i.e. According to the French missionary, Alexander of Rhodes, writing in the middle of the 17th century, the king of Cochin forbade the preaching of the gospel on this score. "You want my subjects to have only one wife," he told them, "but I want them to have several, so that they can produce sons who will be my faithful subjects. Cease, then, to preach so pernicious a doctrine." And he promptly expelled the offending missionaries. After polygamy was made a sin, Cairncross, page 61. Back in 1521, King Henry had written a rebuttal against Martin Luther for his attack on the 7 sacraments of the Catholic religion, which the king called Defense of the 7 Sacraments. In it he called Luther a poisonous serpent and a wolf of hell, which pleased the Pope so much that he called Henry the defender of the faith. But fate plays strange tricks. In a few years Henry would be relying on the words of Luther, which would change his life and his kingdom. In January 1533 the king secretly married Anne Boleyn. On May 23, 1533, a secret sentence was effected to nullify the king's first marriage and to sanction Anne Boleyn as the new queen. Word was sent to Catherine that she was no longer queen and must bear the name of Princess Dowager, but she refused to submit to such degradation. This news brought a sentence of excommunication from the Pope against Henry on July 11, but he was given until September to set himself right by taking back his wife and putting away Anne Boleyn. But about this time, the English Parliament was in the process of passing an act of succession in favor of Anne Boleyn. In September, contrary to the astrologer's forecast for a son, Anne gave birth to a girl, Elizabeth. The Pope was consigned to carry out the king's excommunication. All of this created a new national church for England. Henry was king, but he could not formulate doctrine of the church, nor could he appoint officers therein. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, became the highest office holder in the church in England. Orders were sent out to arrest preachers who still maintained the Pope's authority. The king's subjects were required to swear to the act of succession, and those who refused were sent to the Tower. Sir Thomas More and Bishop Fisher, with 6 other priests, were among the first to be imprisoned. They were warned that they must swear to the succession and supremacy of the king, and were given 6 weeks to do so. Fisher denied that the king was supreme head of the Church of England. More said he would not meddle with such questions. Fisher was condemned on June 17 and was beheaded on Tower Hill on the 22nd. On July 1 More was brought up for trial on a complex indictment, one article of which showed that he did not, like Fisher, expressly repudiate the king's ecclesiastical supremacy, but only kept silence when questioned about it. He made, as might be expected, an admirable defense, but in vain, and after his condemnation, he declared frankly as to the statute that it was against his conscience, as he could never find, in all his studies, that a temporal lord ought to be head of the spiritual. He was sentenced to undergo a traitor's death at Tyburn, but it was commuted by the king to a simple decapitation on Tower Hill, which he suffered on July 6. Cambridge Modern History, Cambridge University, 2443. The story of More's death sent a shock throughout the empire. He was a man of high legal ability, intellectually gifted, possessed wit and humor, and was not persuaded by emotion or deceptions. His learning was entirely without pedantry, even as his humor was without guile. He loved men, he loved animals, he loved mechanism, and every influence that tended to humanize or advance society. He had served his king in diplomatic missions with an ability that was fully appreciated, and as Lord Chancellor, with an integrity that was noted as altogether exceptional. But his very probity had made him at last an obstacle in the king's path, and he was sacrificed. After polygamy was made a sin, Cairncross, page 444. About this time the Archbishop went to interrogate Elizabeth Barton, called the Nun of Canterbury, who professed she had received visions of fearful warnings to the king for his marrying Anne Boleyn. Some supposed she was encouraged by Catherine's friends. Her pronouncement of doom backfired, however, because she was sent to a prison with 6 others for treason and was later executed. The celibate monks did more mischief than they did missionary work. They traversed nearly every area to gather tithes for themselves. It was up to King Henry to determine what their fate would be. Monks in England were neither popular nor devout. One author called them 4 unhappy lepers who despoiled poor wives of the 10th egg. Their lack of dedication to their calling was evident in 1536, when Henry suppressed the smaller monasteries. Church History in Plain Language, Bruce Shelley, page 285. King Henry was an enigma. His life was filled with loose associations with women, even some who bore children, yet he became one of the strongest advocates for plural marriage. He issued strong appeals to both the Catholic Pope and Protestant leaders and gave his full approval to whomever would acknowledge and sustain polygamy. In January, Catherine of Aragon died, and when Henry heard the news, he exclaimed, "God be praised! We are now free from fear of war." If Catherine had lived, history may have been very different. The court and Anne Boleyn wore yellow in mourning for Catherine. But it was not long until Anne herself would also be mourned, for she was apprehended and charged with acts of adultery. She protested her innocence, but did acknowledge some familiarities, whatever that meant. She was taken to the Tower where she, her brother, and 4 supposed paramours were beheaded. King Henry did not mourn long, for the next day he married Jane of Seymour. Henry was a hero to many people and a scum to many others. It makes one wonder if it does polygamy any good to have someone like King Henry as a supporter. The Bible was considered so sacred at this time that the British commoners were not allowed to have one. The Catholic hierarchy felt they were the only ones that could interpret it anyway. An Englishman by the name of William Tyndale, however, saw the need for it to be in the hands of all Englishmen, and one said to a Catholic priest, "If God spares my life, before many years pass I will make it possible for a boy behind a plough to know more scripture than you do." Church Hist. In plain language, B.L. Shelley, page 286. He labored with much difficulty to accomplish that goal and went abroad and printed for importation into England a translation he had made of the New Testament, not from the Latin Vulgate like Wycliffe's, but from the original Greek text. It was smuggled into England and found no lack of purchasers, who were obliged to keep it in secrecy. But every effort was used to put it down. The Cambridge Modern History 2 464-65. He lived to see much of his goal accomplished, but since it was against the law, he was caught, imprisoned and then burned at the stake. His last words were, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes," which in a short time actually happened. Henry, by the request of Thomas Cranmer, whom Henry had made his local pope, was authorized to put together Tyndale's and other versions of the Bible, resulting in the Great Bible, which was ordered to be available in every church in England. Tyndale's prayer had at last been answered. There is an ironic twist in this whole story. After the death of Henry, his only son, the frail 10-year-old son by Jane, his third wife, came to the throne. His advisors helped him lead the nation into accepting Protestant doctrines. He allowed priests to marry, Cranmer's Book of Common Prayer replaced Catholic Latin prayers, and Cranmer's 42 articles were issued which defined the religion of the Church of England. This all stopped when the young king died and Mary, the daughter of Catherine, Henry's first wife, became queen. She returned the empire to Catholicism as the state church. She repealed Archbishop Cranmer's works and sent him to be burned at the stake. In 4 years she sent nearly 300 leading Protestants to their death. Their fate is recorded in John Fox's Book of Martyrs. She soon received the name known to every historian and spoken in every bar-room, Bloody Mary. After her death, Elizabeth I came to the throne. She was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife. This little red-headed, fiery-tempered lady worked extremely hard, and again the empire was turned another way. This time it was headed in a neutral direction with religious peace and toleration. King Henry certainly added an interesting twist of fate into English history, with his strange plural marriages and their divergent offspring. Whatever honor and glory, disrepute or disgrace, that was attributed to the great Church of England, it should be remembered that it was started by a polygamist, John Lacer. From the time of Christ to the latter part of the 16th century, there were alternate efforts to either outlaw plural marriage or to promote it. Both the popes and Protestant leaders took turns on both sides of the issue. With the aid of the Gutenberg printing press and the availability of the scriptures, many pamphlets and books began to be published supporting plural marriage. John Lacer came out with a great work in 1682 called Polygamy Triumphant, containing over 500 pages, with nearly every supporting quote by leading scholars, ministers and even some Catholics. Its logic and common sense appealed to many people, even in other countries, but the general public accepted the subject more from curiosity than for an application in their lives. It was so well received that it became a sort of source book on the subject. But teaching people to live polygamy then, as now, had a similar effect of trying to sell someone a disease. Lacer's spirited defense of polygamy is almost without equal, especially for a man who could hardly support or handle one wife. He was poor, frail, downcast and nervous, but he devoted his life to publishing his works in support of the principle of plural marriage. From his meager earnings and from extra winnings at chess, this man struggled to publish and republish his books. His first work, entitled Discourse on Polygamy, came at a time when people were prone not to marry at all because of the high cost of children, home expenses and helping in-laws. This publication was a dialogue between a polygamist and a monogamist, part of which follows. 1. How can the wretched husband manage single-handed to deal with a horde of wives? 2. We have to bear our cross in this world. In any case, one cock can cope with several hens and impregnate them. 2. 3. But who will feed the wives? 4. Consider the lilies of the field and the fowls of the air. Go to the cock, O thou of little faith, and ask him who feeds the hens. On the day of judgment the Turks and Gentiles will resuscitate and accuse Christians of lack of faith, though God's message regards polygamy is clear enough. Nowhere does the Bible say that one man should be limited to one woman. 5. No doubt, but women will never accept polygamy. 6. Indignantly, did not God set men in authority over them? In any case, women will submit to it if properly indoctrinated. And look at all the sins that spring from monogamy. It drives women to arrogance and domination over men. What is even more serious, monogamy leads to onanism, by which lacer means intercourse with sterile or pregnant women, abortion, infanticide, whoremongering and adultery. All these could be abolished if polygamy were admitted. After polygamy was made a sin, Cairncross, page 77. Other arguments in favor of plural marriage, some from other authors, were also included in Lacer's works, such as 1. It would expand the family size, income and influence. 2. It would be easier for girls to find a good husband. 3. It would allow all girls a chance to be married. 4. Children would be cared for at home by other mothers if a wife was ill or away. 5. Fathers would have more help at their vocation and at home, and children would have more friends and ties within the family circle. 6. Wives would vie with each other with their best appearance and personality. 7. The man would gain much greater experience in handling women than in monogamy. 8. The man would have a much greater source of counsel from several wives than from one. 9. It would mean more converts to Christianity from the many polygamous countries of the world. 10. It would help prevent immoral temptations, abortion, fornication, adultery, illegitimate children, prostitution and divorce. Martin Maiden. Between 1680 and 1750 there was another upswing in the polygamous campaign, both in Germany and England. One of the most prominent advocates was the Englishman, Martin Maiden, a disciple of the John Wesley Church. But his work came later with a 3-volume publication in 1781, called Thelethora or Female Ruin. He mentioned that under the current laws, women were considered less than the beasts of the field. A person could seduce, defile, or abandon to prostitution and ruin 1,000 women, married or unmarried, and suffer less than if he should steal or kill an ox or a sheep. Maiden wanted to influence the laws of man to again conform to the laws of God. In his preface he wrote, "Yet such is the system under which we have been living from generation to generation, and which will be transmitted to the latest posterity, with all its growing and increasing mischiefs. Unless the apparent necessity of a reformation shall make us willing to receive and adopt the only means of it, what those means are, it is the purpose of this book to lay before the public eye, and to recommend, in the most earnest and serious manner, to legislative interposition. Not as opposing one human scheme to another, but as restoring the divine government to its due honor and respect, and of course to its salutary influence over the manners and actions of mankind." Preface to Thelethora, I.Iv. Dr. Maiden's work was a masterpiece of research and scholarship. His publication is still considered one of the most authoritative and reasonable arguments ever made in support of plural marriage. He contended that plural marriage was practiced and sustained in the Old Testament with the sanction of God, that Christ descended from King David, who was a polygamist, and therefore that lineage was not condemned. He gives point after point of support and proof, showing that Christ never condemned anyone for teaching or living it, and he didn't even give any warning that it might be a temptation to be avoided. Dr. Maiden not only wanted the laws to sanction polygamy, but he insisted on the Old Testament law that anyone seducing a girl must marry her. Furthermore, he insisted on another biblical law, imposing the death penalty for anyone guilty of adultery. Dr. Maiden appealed to the public to compare the results of a people who live monogamy to those living polygamy. He quoted Jesus saying that we could judge a tree by its fruits, so we should see what happens in both these lifestyles. He said, "The only real and substantial difference between the ancient Jews and the Christians is this. The former took a plurality of women whom they maintained, protected and provided for agreeable to God's word. The latter take a plurality of women and turn them out to ruin and destruction, not only against God's word, but against every principle of justice and humanity. Or in other words, if the Jew took as many as he could maintain, the Christian ruins as many as he can debauch. From the Thelfthora quoted in After Polygamy Was Made a Sin, page 159. Maiden was not alone in his support of plural marriage at this time, as it was also favored by such great and thinking men as Milton, Boswell, Newton, Rousseau, Spinoza, Napoleon, and Schopenhauer. Napoleon Bonaparte, 1769–1821, Emperor of France, was also a noted military genius. He had concluded that it was not just military armaments that won peace among nations, but also the giving of wives to the kings of nations was a brilliant and effective method for securing peace treaties. He wanted to introduce polygamy in the West Indies, with the idea that it would spread from there. He even went to consult with Catholic theologians on the possibility of changing the church doctrine that suppressed polygamy. Adultery had become more tolerable than polygamy. In France, the Penal Code of 1791 abolished a penalty for adultery, yet polygamy remained a crime. To force the breakup of polygamous marriages, either centuries ago or presently, is a violation of individuals' natural and lawful rights, and creates a disruption of family unity. It is the destruction of sacred vows and the sanctioning of divorce. It casts mothers and children into a hostile world to fend for themselves. It is against the laws of God that state, "What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder." Mark 10:9. It is no more correct for monogamists to break up marriages of polygamists than for polygamists using similar reasons and means to destroy monogamist marriages. Since warfare continues to exist in this world, and other causes of death for thousands of young men, a surplus of women also continues. Valiant and faithful men should accept these women in plural marriage. Napoleon had much to say about women. He was in favor of the Orientals who advocated and practiced women's servitude to men. He also mentioned that plural marriage was a natural lifestyle for a couple. She stops being a wife when she can no longer give her husband children. Man, who nature impedes neither by age nor by any of these disadvantages, must have several wives. Memorial of Saint Helen, Las Cases, 1676. His reasoning may have been influenced by the fact that his first wife, Josephine, who was sterile, had been deceiving him, and he had to put a perpetual watch over her night and day. He noted how well the Oriental males had subjugated their women, yet he claimed they were just as happy as the women in the West. Again he wrote, "Mahomet seems to have known the secret and to have acted accordingly. Otherwise, how would a man who followed so closely in the steps of Christianity and swerved so little from it, not have suppressed polygamy? Can it be said that he kept it because his religion was utterly sensual? But then he would have allowed the Muslims an indefinite number of wives and not restricted them to 4. Ibid. Page 374. Arthur Schopenhauer, 1788–1860, the noted German philosopher, lecturer and author, was another advocate of plural marriage. He read published works in German, Italian, English, and French. He believed in a certain type of spiritualism, claiming that portions of his work, The World as Will and Idea, was dictated by the Holy Ghost. He was a pessimist, but contended that man should labor for the suppression of desire, but aim for a sort of nirvana as taught by the Orientals. Although he supported polygamy as a virtue, when his wife died, he remained a bachelor. He thought that the monogamous women of the West were artificial and had mastery over their husbands. He claimed that monogamy created old maids or prostitutes, but that nature's aim is to increase the species. A man can engender 100 children a year, but a woman can bear only one in that length of time. James Campbell said, Having seen all the continents of the globe and many islands of the sea, and having observed human society in every climate and in every social condition, I have at length returned to my native land, an older, and I hope, a wiser man. Polygamy and Monogamy, Campbell, page 16. He related the story of an aged Native American Indian who had 2 wives. When the Christian missionaries came to convert him, he was told that he must give up one or the other of them. One was an aged but faithful companion, the other a younger one with a child and his only heir. He could not decide which wife he should leave, so he left it up to the missionaries. They decided against the young one. The Indian wrote, "And thus, in 1 hour, was that young wife and mother deprived of her husband, her child, her character, and her home, and sent away a bereaved and lonely outcast into the wide world." The report which the missionaries themselves gave of this affair closed by saying that the repudiated wife and bereaved mother soon died inconsolable and broken-hearted. I now began to blush at my own late ignorance and bigotry. And the more I thought of the ecclesiastical tyranny of the North American missionaries, the higher rose my indignation against it. I could not fail to see that their narrow attachment to their own social system had made them judicially blind to the merits of any other, and that they were more ignorant of the true spirit of Christianity, as well as of the natural rights of man concerning the laws of marriage, than even the poor savages themselves. Ibid. Pages 21 to 22. It is a common thought that every king would like to have more subjects, every merchant would like more customers, every farmer would like more land, and every good man would like more wives and children. Polygamy is a natural instinct for a man, and when he is prevented from plural marriage, it creates a frustration in his emotional character. The Reformation was an attempt to turn back centuries of changes that had crept into the Catholic Church. It was a notable effort to reform and return the early Christian and Judaic laws of the Bible to the Church, and many original doctrines were brought back. The Reformation was an heroic effort which actually set the stage for the Restoration. Chapter 14. The Americans. Land of religious freedom? Both governments and religions were growing like mushrooms, and some lasted about as long. Religions wanted control over governments, and governments tried to get control over religions. Unfortunately, God usually had little to do with either. Their laws and the laws of God were frequently in conflict. A few souls attempted to get out from under such secular and ecclesiastical bondage and sought for a new land and new freedom. They called the new country America a place where good men and women could accept God's laws as their laws. It seemed to be his desire also, for later he said, "For verily I say unto you, my law shall be kept on this land." D&C 58:19. Men who loved freedom and good government were selected to write those laws into a constitution, as God explained. And for this purpose have I established the constitution of this land, by the hands of wise men whom I raised up unto this very purpose. The end. C 100-180. Government organization usually reflects the personality of its people. The citizens of a nation seldom get a better or worse government than they deserve. The political architects of this country knew what they were doing. As the Mayflower Pilgrims had written that their great hope and inward zeal is for the propagating and advancing the gospel of the kingdom of Christ in these remote parts of the world. Christian History of the Constitution, Verna Hall, PVE. The primary reason most people started coming to America was because they finally heard of a nation that had religious liberty. That term was best described by Henry Campbell Black, who wrote the famous Black's Law Dictionary, which, after more than a century, is still being used. He defined religious liberty as freedom from dictation, constraint, or control in matters affecting the conscience, religious beliefs, and the practice of religion, freedom to entertain and express any or no system of religious opinions, and to engage in or refrain from any form of religious observance. Page 723. The customs, traditions, and personal beliefs regarding marriage are an important part of one's religion, and the U.S. Constitution offered its citizens those rights, leaving the conscience of a man untrammeled as long as he injured no one. He was free to marry one wife, several wives, or no wife at all. But this idea was short-lived even in America. Men who entered into public office were soon tempted with power, position, and wealth, and America began to be more and more like other nations. Laws, privileges, and rights were changed and became more restrictive. The Constitution said one thing and the politicians something else, and, for that matter, they still do. Conflicts arose between religion and civil government because government was in violation of the Establishment of Religion Clause, fostering excessive entanglement between government and religion. Justice Black once delivered a decision, Everson v. Board of Education, in which he clearly explained, "The Establishment of Religion Clause of the First Amendment means at least this: neither a state nor the federal government can set up a church. Neither can pass laws which aid one religion, aid all religions, or prefer one religion over another. Neither can force nor influence a person to go to or to remain away from church against his will, or force him to profess a belief or disbelief in any religion. No person can be punished for entertaining or professing religious beliefs or disbeliefs, for church attendance or non-attendance." In the words of Jefferson, the clause against establishment of religion by law was intended to erect a wall of separation between church and state. Constitutional Law, Freund, Sutherland, Howe, Brown, page 1351. Justice Black referred to other major decisions relating to the protection of a religion and its members. The First Amendment has erected a wall between church and state. That wall must be kept high and impregnable. We could not approve the slightest breach. That amendment requires the state to be neutral in its relations with groups of religious believers and non-believers. It does not require the state to be their adversary. State power is no more to be used so as to handicap religions than it is to favor them. Neither so high nor so impregnable today as yesterday is the wall raised between church and state by Virginia's great statute of religious freedom and the First Amendment, now made applicable to all the states by the 14th. There is not a shadow of right in the general government to intermeddle with religion, and that this subject is, for the honor of America, perfectly free and unshackled. The government has no jurisdiction over it. Madison opposed every form and degree of official relation between religion and civil authority. For him, religion was a wholly private matter beyond the scope of civil power, either to restrain or to support. Denial or abridgment of religious freedom was a violation of rights both of conscience and of natural equality. In recent years, the doctrine of Watson v. Jones has been given constitutional status, so that it now seems that the states and nation are compelled to respect not merely the religious liberty of natural persons, but to secure the liberty of churches, domestic and foreign, to govern themselves without interference by American secular authority, whether legislative or judicial. See Kedroff v. St. Nicholas Cathedral, 344 U.S. 94, 1952. But our concern is not with the wisdom of legislation, but with its constitutional limitation. If the purpose or effect of a law is to impede the observance of one or all religions or is to discriminate invidiously between religions, that law is constitutionally invalid, even though the burden may be characterized as being only indirect. Braunfeld v. Brown, U.S., at 607. The test may be stated as follows. What are the purpose and primary effect of the enactment? If either is the advancement or inhibition of religion, then the enactment exceeds the scope of legislative power as circumscribed by the Constitution. That is to say that to withstand the strictures of the Establishment Clause, there must be a secular legislative purpose and a primary effect that neither advances nor inhibits religion. Everson v. Board of Education, Supra, McGowan v. Maryland, U.S. 420-442, 1961. The Free Exercise Clause, likewise considered many times here, withdraws from legislative power, state and federal, the exertion of any restraint on the free exercise of religion. Its purpose is to secure religious liberty in the individual by prohibiting any invasions thereof by civil authority. Further, it is no defense to urge that the religious practices here may be relatively minor encroachments on the First Amendment. The breach of neutrality that is today a trickling stream may all too soon become a raging torrent, and, in the words of Madison, it is proper to take alarm at the first experiment on our liberties. Memorial and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessments, quoted in Everson, Supra at 65. The antecedents of today's decision are many and unmistakable. They are rooted in the foundation soil of our nation. They are fundamental to freedom. Government in our democracy, state and national, must be neutral in matters of religious theory, doctrine, and practice. It may not be hostile to any religion or to the advocacy of no religion, and it may not aid, foster, or promote one religion or religious theory against another, or even against the militant opposite. The First Amendment mandates governmental neutrality between religion and between religion and non-religion. The place of religion in our society is an exalted one, achieved through a long tradition of reliance on the home, the church, and the inviolable citadel of the individual heart and mind. We have come to recognize through bitter experience that it is not within the power of government to invade that citadel, whether its purpose or effect be to aid or oppose, to advance or retard. In the relationship between man and religion, the state is firmly committed to a position of neutrality. Though the application of that rule requires interpretation of a delicate sort, the rule itself is clearly and concisely stated in the words of the First Amendment. Ibid. See pages 1351-1354. An outstanding feature of the Constitution was that it limited the power of the federal government rather than of its citizens. The Constitution was to serve as a leash upon its politicians, but unfortunately there were still enough loopholes for political rats to crawl through and destroy the American dream. That such freedom means also freedom to make disastrous experiments only drives home again that no country can ever be a government of laws and not of men, but only a government partly of laws, around which ill-chosen men will build ill practices or well-chosen men build wise ones. National Encyclopedia 3 240. So under this protective umbrella of the Constitution supposedly assuring separation of church and state, the gospel of Jesus Christ was restored to Joseph Smith. The Mormons, more than any other people, had reason to support, defend and promote the Constitution. It offered them the greatest protection for religious beliefs and practices. The prophet Joseph loved this heavenly banner. Hence we say that the Constitution of the United States is a glorious standard. It is founded in the wisdom of God. It is a heavenly banner. It is to all those who are privileged with the sweets of liberty, like the cooling shades and refreshing waters of a great rock in a thirsty and weary land. It is like a great tree under whose branches men from every clime can be shielded from the burning rays of the sun. TPJS, page 147. As broad as the Constitution was, and as much as the greatest minds of the nation put into it, Joseph Smith noticed a weakness, which over the passage of time, has proved to be very prophetic. It is one of the first principles of my life, and one that I have cultivated from my childhood, having been taught it by my father, to allow everyone the liberty of conscience. I am the greatest advocate of the Constitution of the United States there is on the earth. In my feelings I am always ready to die for the protection of the weak and oppressed in their just rights. The only fault I find with the Constitution is, it is not broad enough to cover the whole ground. Although it provides that all men shall enjoy religious freedom, yet it does not provide the manner by which that freedom can be preserved, nor for the punishment of government officers who refuse to protect the people in their religious rights, or punish those mobs, states, or communities who interfere with the rights of the people on account of their religion. Its sentiments are good, but it provides no means of enforcing them. It has but this one fault. Under its provision, a man or a people who are able to protect themselves can get along well enough, but those who have the misfortune to be weak or unpopular are left to the merciless rage of popular fury. TPJS, pages 326-27. In 1788, when several state conventions were ratifying the U.S. Constitution, they decided to more clearly identify the rights offered to its citizens, resulting in what is now referred to as the Bill of Rights. The very first of these 10 amendments states, Article 1. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assembly, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Based on the strength of the Constitution and Bill of Rights, Joseph Smith and his followers incorporated an article in their belief structure that stated, "We believe in obeying, honoring, and sustaining the law." Article of Faith number 12. The question has been asked many times since then, what law? The Lord himself answered, "And that law of the land which is constitutional, supporting that principle of freedom and maintaining rights and privileges, belongs to all mankind, and is justifiable before me. Therefore, I, the Lord, justify you, and your brethren of my church, in befriending that law which is the constitutional law of the land. And as pertaining to law of man, whatsoever is more or less than this, cometh of evil. I, the Lord God, make you free, therefore ye are free indeed, and the law also maketh you free." D&C 98 5-8. In another article of faith, it was worded even more emphatically. We claim, not merely believe, the privilege of worshipping Almighty God according to the dictates of our own conscience, and allow all men the same privilege, let them worship how, where, or what they may. Article of Faith number 11. This was the same principle the Constitution advocated, so whatsoever is more or less than this, cometh of evil. The Supreme Court was instituted to enforce these individual constitutional rights, and should be supported by federal, state and local law officials. One of their rulings explained this. Certain aspects of religious exercise cannot, in any way, be restricted or burdened by either federal or state legislation. Compulsion by law of the acceptance of any creed or the practice of any form of worship is strictly forbidden. The freedom to hold religious beliefs and opinions is absolute. Cantwell v. Connecticut, 310 U.S. 296, 303. Other legal sources also emphasize the fact that governments cannot control or force a change in anyone's religion. The constitutional limitations have a dual aspect. They prevent the legal compulsion to accept any creed or the practice of any form of worship on one hand, and, on the other hand, permit the free exercise of a chosen form of religion. The freedom of religion protected against federal legislation by the First Amendment of the Federal Constitution is also protected against invasion by state action by reason of the 14th Amendment Due Process Clause, 6. What is freedom of religion? It embraces the right to maintain theories of life, of death, and of the hereafter, which are rank heresy to followers of the orthodox faiths. 7. It allows everyone under the jurisdiction of the United States to entertain such notions respecting his relations to his Maker and the duties they impose as may be approved by his judgment and conscience, and to exhibit his sentiments in such form of worship as he may think proper, not injurious to the equal rights of others. American Law and Procedure, LaSalle Extension University, 1290d. In other words, the government cannot tell a person what to believe or what religious beliefs to practice. What good is a religion if you are permitted to just believe in it? Is there any value in believing the 10 Commandments without practicing them? George Washington understood the important role of religion and morality within a nation. Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness. Stand fast by our Constitution, J. Reuben Clark, page 27. But great speeches and noble thoughts of American patriots were soon in conflict with new and improved state and federal laws, especially those concerning religious freedom. Men in government proved traitors to their oath of office. The prophet Joseph noticed this and advised the saints. The different states, and even Congress itself, have passed many laws diametrically contrary to the Constitution of the United States. Shall we be such fools as to be governed by its laws, which are unconstitutional? No. DHC 5289. The Latter-day Saints were among the first American citizens to learn from experience of such two-faced hypocrisy. They became more and more unpopular, their freedoms could not be preserved, unjust government officers were not punished, nor were mobs in states who deprived the Mormons of their constitutional rights. The corrupt government was more merciless than the vicious mobs. The saints had no appeal within the government, since officials on all levels were equally guilty. Government should exist to protect its citizens, showing no discrimination because of race, politics, or religion. As a public servant, it should offer service without special favors for certain people. In other words, a policeman protects a Catholic, not because he is a Catholic, but because he is a citizen. A fireman protects a church, not because it is Protestant, but because it is a part of society. Public servants are in office to protect Catholics, Jews, Protestants, and Mormons, without asking them. Are you identified with a particular religion, or are you incorporated with the government? A state may not adopt programs or practices which aid or oppose any religion. Abington School District, 374 U.S., at 225. Also, a state has no legitimate interest in protecting any or all religions from views distasteful to them. Justice Clark in Burstein v. Wilson, 343 U.S. 1952. When a government turns from protecting religions to invading or persecuting them, it has turned from being a public servant to a public menace. When a government tries to dictate and control the beliefs and practices of a religion, it has assumed the power of a god. But such powers, decisions and rights are not intended to be invested with Caesar. They are still and always will be invested with God the Father, who has his own plan to be carried out among the righteous saints, as Aristus No stated. Now, when the Lord raised up the prophet Joseph to lay the foundation of this church, he found monogamy instead of polygamy to be the rule of Christendom, and he enjoined, in the early revelations to this church, that every woman cleave unto her husband, and that every man cleave unto his wife and none else, saying that he that looketh upon a woman to lust after her who is not his wife hath committed adultery already with her in his heart. This was the law governing Christendom, which had been inherited by the Gentiles for ages past, and introduced among the Roman Empire, and perpetuated by the Roman Church and the Protestant churches that had sprung out of her. And the Lord in the early history of this people continued this order of things, but revealed unto the prophet Joseph, nevertheless, that the time would come when he would require his people to enter into plural marriage, as he did Abraham and the prophets of old, to bring about his purposes in the latter days. Joseph revealed this unto some of the first elders of the church, taking care to enjoin them that they must preserve these things in their own hearts, that the time had not yet come when the Lord required his people to enter into this order. But the time would come when he would require them to do so. This was made manifest in the early stages of this church, but not until 1843 was this law committed to writing and given to the people. This revelation we find in the Book of Doctrine and Covenants. Aristus No, J.D. 24 164-65. So here in America, too, there began to be a distinct difference between the marriage laws of God and those of man. Legally, the rights and type of marriage should be a matter of personal preference, religious, civil, or by private contract. However, shortly after the Constitution was ratified, some states began to establish marriage laws limiting these individual rights. Among those states were 5 in which Joseph Smith lived: Vermont, New York, Ohio, Missouri, and Illinois. The laws restricting polygamy in each of these states are briefly presented here. Vermont passed the following law of 1797, which was a civil law against any persons who wanted to live plural marriage. Sec. 23. And it is hereby further enacted, that if any person or persons in this state being married, or who shall hereafter marry, shall, at any time, marry any other person, the former husband or wife being alive, or shall continue to live together so married, every such offender being thereof convicted before the Supreme Court of Judicature, shall be punished as in case of adultery, and every person so offending may be tried in the county in which he or she shall be apprehended. Statutes of Vermont R. 1797, page 165. This law was in force at the time Joseph Smith was born, December 23, 1805, in Sharon, Windsor County, Vermont. It seemed that the devil knew what Joseph would do and was setting up his barriers among the laws of men. The influence and traditions of the Holy Roman Empire were already making their appearance in America. In 1815, Joseph Smith's family moved to Wayne County, New York. A state law had already been established there on February 7, 1788, against certain types of marriage. It was revised and clarified in 1813, 2 years before Joseph and his family arrived there. It reads: Chap. XXIV. An act to restrain all persons from marrying until their former wives and former husbands be dead. Passed 7 February, 1788. Be it enacted by the people of the state of New York, represented in Senate and Assembly, and it is hereby enacted by the authority of the same, that if any person or persons being married, or who hereafter shall marry, do at any time marry any person or persons, the former husband or wife being alive, then every such offense shall be felony. Laws of the State of New York, revised and passed at the 36th session of the Legislature, 1813, pages 113 to 114. Joseph Smith arrived in Kirtland, Ohio, in early 1831. Here he was met by another state law on the marriage issue, passed just 7 years previously. It stated, Sec. 7. That if any married person, having a husband or wife living, shall marry any other person, every person so offending shall be deemed guilty of a high misdemeanor, and upon conviction thereof, shall be imprisoned in the penitentiary, and kept at hard labor, not exceeding 7 nor less than 3 years. First session of the 22nd General Assembly of the State of Ohio, begun and held in the town of Columbus, December 1, 1823. Vol. XXII. An Act for the Punishment of Crimes. Sec. 7. Bigamy. In the middle of July 1831, Joseph Smith and a few of his companions went to Jackson County, Missouri, where the following statute was already in force. Sec. 76. Be it further enacted, that if any person or persons, within this state, being married, or who shall hereafter marry, do at any time marry any person or persons, the former husband or wife being alive, upon conviction thereof, here they shall be whipped, not exceeding 39 stripes. Be fined and not less than $100, nor more than $500, and imprisoned, not less than 6 nor more than 12 months, and thereafter be rendered infamous, be incapable of giving testimony, or holding any office, civil or military, within this state. Laws of the State of Missouri. Revised and digested by authority of the General Assembly, 1825, pages 305 to 306. When the Saints were driven from Missouri to Illinois, they were at first welcomed and treated fairly by the local citizens. However, they found an anti-polygamy law in that state as well. Sec. 121. Bigamy consists in the having of 2 wives or 2 husbands at one and the same time, knowing that the former husband or wife is still alive. If any person or persons within this state, being married, or who shall hereafter marry, do at any time marry any person or persons within this state, being married, or who shall hereafter marry, do at any time marry any person or persons, the former husband or wife being alive, the person so offending shall, on conviction thereof, be punished by a fine not exceeding $1,000, and imprisoned in the penitentiary not exceeding 2 years. Revised Laws of Illinois, 1833, pages 198 to 199. Thus, the 5 states where Joseph Smith resided all had laws against plural marriage. These state laws were made after the creation and ratification of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights in conflict with guaranteed rights, and also in opposition to the marriage practices of the ancient prophets and patriarchs of God. Joseph Smith was well aware of the laws of the land and could see that they were in conflict with the laws of God. His teachings and conduct proved which laws he considered to be the most important. Chapter 15. The Mormons. The restoration of plural marriage. In the foregoing chapters of this book we have studied the history and attitudes of many different people and nations toward the principle of plural marriage. Kings and paupers, prophets and priests, rich and poor, have recognized the beneficent attributes of polygamy. From the Congo to the most industrialized nations and from every color, religion and nationality, have come favorable statements regarding this marriage lifestyle. Now we come to the restoration of plural marriage as part of the gospel of Jesus Christ revealed to the prophet Joseph Smith. We will read what the Lord himself had to say about plural marriage in this dispensation, and what the response of the saints has been toward these revelations. The Lord has emphasized the important connection between plural marriage and the laws of the holy priesthood. Apparently, the reasons why plural marriage was introduced into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints are still a mystery to most Mormons. However, Elder Mark E. Peterson gave one good reason. Why was plural marriage practiced by the Latter-day Saints? Only about 4% of them ever entered into this form of matrimony, but why did even they? When the Apostle Peter spoke, as is recorded in Acts 3, he referred to the second coming of the Savior and indicated that this great event will not take place until the time of the restoration of all things spoken by the Lord through his prophets from the beginning of the world. All things were to be restored. Would this include plural marriage? It did, and hence section 132 of the Doctrine and Covenants was given. In verses 40 and 45 of that section, as he speaks of plural marriage to Joseph Smith, the Lord refers to it as part of the restoration of all things. The prophet Joseph did not wish to enter polygamy. It was farthest from his mind. But he was the restorer, and through him all things must be restored. Hence, under the persuasion of the Lord, he accepted it. This is why there was polygamy among the Mormons. Way of the Master, Peterson, page 43. Polygamy had to be restored because men had previously apostatized from obeying God's command to live it. Interestingly, Elder Mark E. Peterson, who understood the genuine necessity of its restoration, probably became the foremost church opponent of plural marriage. History has definitely repeated itself. The early Christians abandoned many true principles and practices and adopted the ways of the Gentile Romans. The Mormons abandoned many eternal principles and adopted the ways of the Gentile Americans. This transition has come by slow, subtle means until those who once were its greatest defenders became its greatest opponents. A brief chronology of the LDS Church's evolution and their attitude toward plural marriage, 1829 to the present, is outlined in this chapter. This more recent history is not much different from the conditions that have been repeated many times previously in the history of the world and its cultures and religions. 1829. Even before the organization of the church on April 6, 1830, the prophet Joseph Smith received a revelation supporting the principle of plural marriage. Charles Walker recorded in his journal. At night went to the 14th Ward meeting. Brigham spoke ... said that while Joseph and Oliver were translating the Book of Mormon, they had a revelation that the order of patriarchal marriage and the sealing was right. Oliver said unto Joseph, Brother Joseph, why don't we go into the order of polygamy and practice it as the ancients did? We know it is true, then why delay? Joseph's reply was, I know that we know it is true and from God, but the time has not yet come. This did not seem to suit Oliver, who expressed a determination to go into the order of plural marriage anyhow, although, he was ignorant of the order and pattern and the results. Joseph said, Oliver, if you go into this thing, it is not with my faith or consent. Disregarding the counsel of Joseph, Oliver Cowdery took to wife Miss Annie Lyman, cousin to Geo. A. Smith. From that time he went into darkness and lost the spirit. Annie Lyman is still alive, a witness to these things. Charles Walker Journal, July 26, 1872. 1831. Within 2 years, July 17, 1831, another revelation came to the prophet Joseph while he and others were on a mission to the Indians. W. W. Phelps made a copy of that revelation which said, in part, Verily, I say unto you, that the wisdom of man, in his fallen state, knoweth not the purposes and the privileges of my holy priesthood, but ye shall know when ye receive a fullness by reason of the anointing. For it is my will, that in time Ye should take unto you wives of the Lamanites and Nephites, that their posterity may become white, delightsome and just, for even now their females are more virtuous than the Gentiles. Phelps added later, about 3 years after this was given, I asked Brother Joseph privately, how we that were mentioned in the Revelation could take wives from the natives as we were all married men? He replied instantly, in the same manner that Abraham took Hagar and Keturah, and Jacob took Rachel, Bilhah, and Zilpah. By revelation the saints of the Lord are always directed by revelation. Letter to Press. Brigham Young from W. W. Phelps, August 12, 1861, Church History Library. Ezra Booth, a Protestant minister who joined the LDS Church and later apostatized, published an account of this 1831 revelation on December 8, 1831, in the Ohio Star. He wrote that it has been made known by revelation that it would be pleasing to the Lord if the elders formed a matrimonial alliance with the natives. Elder James S. Brown, who was a Mormon missionary among the Shoshone Indians in 1853, said that he was told by church leaders to marry among them if we would be permitted to take young daughters of the chief and leading men. Life of a Pioneer, Brown, page 320. Oliver Cowdery was probably the first person in this dispensation to enter into plural marriage, sometime shortly after 1832. He was perhaps too eager to enter it, while Joseph was too reluctant, as he postponed it until his life was threatened. Mary Lightner said, an angel came to him, and the last time he came with a drawn sword in his hand and told Joseph if he did not go into that principle, he would slay him. Life and Testimony of Mary Lightner, page 58. Legally, such plural marriages were next to impossible, even though under the laws of the Constitution, a civil marriage could be created by common law contract, a judge, or by religious ceremony. However, plural marriage in the early 1830s was almost unknown in America. 1835. The law in Ohio did not recognize Mormon leaders as legal ministers. However, in 1835 Joseph said, our elders have been wronged and prosecuted for marrying without a license. The Lord God of Israel has given me authority to unite the people in the holy bonds of matrimony. And from this time forth I shall use that privilege and marry whomsoever I see fit. Lydia Knight's History, page 31. This occurred on the 14th of November, 1835, when Lydia Goldthwait Bailey was going to be married to Newell Knight. Joseph gave an account of that Mormon wedding ceremony. I then remarked that marriage was an institution of heaven, instituted in the Garden of Eden, that it was necessary it should be solemnized by the authority of the everlasting priesthood. The ceremony was original with me. DHC 2320. Later, on January 17, 1836, Joseph married 3 other couples and gave them a marriage certificate, one of them as follows. Form of marriage certificate. I hereby certify that, agreeable to the rules and regulations of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, on matrimony, Mr. William F. Cahoon and Miss Nancy M. Gibbs, both of this place, were joined in marriage, on Sabbath, the 17th instant. Joseph Smith, June, presiding elder of said church. Kirtland, Ohio, January 19, 1836. DHC 2377. This was the beginning of a matrimonial conflict between political marriages and priesthood marriages. It was very difficult for Joseph Smith to reveal all of the doctrines of the kingdom to the saints. Even Jesus could not teach openly the deeper doctrines and told his disciples, it is given unto you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them, the people, it is not given. Matt. 13:11, in explaining why there was a difference in who should hear them and who should not, he said, for this people's heart is waxed gross, and their ears are dull of hearing, and their eyes they have closed. Matt. 13:15, in other words, they preferred to maintain their worldly customs and traditions. See Joseph Smith's full explanation of this text in TPJS pages 96 to 98. The prophet expressed a similar view when he referred to the Latter-day Saints. But there has been a great difficulty in getting anything into the heads of this generation. It has been like splitting hemlock knots with a corn dodger for a wedge and a pumpkin for a beetle. Even the saints are slow to understand. I have tried for a number of years to get the minds of the saints prepared to receive the things of God, but we frequently see some of them, after suffering all they have for the work of God, will fly to pieces like glass as soon as anything comes that is contrary to their traditions. They cannot stand the fire at all. DHC 6 184 to 185. 1843. Because of such deeply entrenched traditions, members of the church were not prepared to accept plural marriage. Joseph Lee Robinson recorded one of Joseph Smith's first attempts to teach the doctrine publicly. Again we heard the prophet say upon the stand in Nauvoo in a grove near the temple, when he was speaking to a large assemblage of saints, with many other things he said, "If I should reveal the things that God has revealed to me, there are some on this stand that would cut my throat or take my heart's blood." We wondered if it was possible that that saying could be true. And again while speaking to the people in that place he supposed a case. He said, "Suppose we send one of our elders to Turkey or India or to a people where it was lawful to have several wives, where they practiced polygamy, and he should say to them "Why, oh, your laws are not good, you should put away your plural wives." What would they do to him? They would kick him out of their realm, said he. "And when the elder shall come round again, this brother shall accost him, thus saying, Elder, is there not a land of Zion, a place where the saints should gather to?" The elder should not lie to him. He shall say, "Yes, brother, there is a land of Zion where saints of God are required to gather to." Then said he to the elder, "I have 5 wives, and I love one equally as well as I do the other, and now what are the laws in that land? Can I bring my 5 wives there and enjoy them there as well as I can here?" Said the prophet, "Yes, the laws in Zion are such that you can bring your wives and enjoy them here, as well as there." The elder shall say to that brother. The prophet went on preaching the gospel of the kingdom, as if he had not said anything strange or awful, but this to me was the first intimation that I ever received that polygamy would ever be practiced or lawful with this people. The prophet went to his dinner, and as it might be expected, several of the first women of the church collected at the prophet's house with his wife, said thus to the prophet Joseph, "Oh, Mr. Smith, you have done it now. It will never do. Why, it is all but blasphemy. You must take back what you have said today. It is outrageous. It would ruin us as a people." The prophet knew it would not avail anything to contend with the sisters. Said he, "I will have to take that saying back and leave it, as though there had been nothing said," for he was aware it was a very large pill for them or the people to swallow, but as the Lord had revealed the principle of plural marriage to him, and had informed him that the time had fully come that that doctrine should be taught and practiced by his people, the Latter-day Saints. As it was a very important item pertaining to the fullness of the gospel there, he deemed it wisdom to throw out something for the people to reflect upon, that they might begin to digest that very important doctrine, which belongs to the dispensation of the fullness of times. We attended the meeting in the afternoon. The prophet arose to address the meeting. He said, "Brethren and sisters, I take back what we said this morning and leave it as though there had been nothing said." It amused me somewhat, but it didn't take with me, for I was satisfied that he meant what he said in the morning. Joseph Lee Robinson Journal, pages 12, 13, 14. In 1855, Apostle George A. Smith recalled the reaction of the people to these same remarks by Joseph Smith. It produced such a tremendous excitement that, as soon as he had got his dinner half eaten, he had to go back to the stand and unpreach all that he had preached, and left the people to guess at the matter. J.D. 217. Nearly 15 years after Joseph's first revelation on plural marriage, he received another one on July 12, 1843. CD&C section 132. It was a revelation that would shock the world. If his name was not already known for good and evil, it soon would be. Most ministers, lawyers, women, and congressmen began publicly speaking or privately whispering about his revelation. From around the general store pickle barrel to the halls of Congress, Joe Smith was a common conversation piece. At one time he was confined to jails and dungeons, and the next he was a candidate for President of the United States. Trying to keep a sane and sensible appearance in the midst of rumors, lies, and pink sheet newspaper articles was a most difficult task for him. The announcement of polygamy would just make it worse. The revelation of 1843 did not come about because Joseph wanted to live plural marriage, but rather because he wanted to understand how the Lord could justify Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, David, and Solomon for their many wives. CD&C 132:1. The Lord answered him and said, "Behold, and lo, I am the Lord thy God, and will answer thee as touching this matter. Therefore, prepare thy heart to receive and obey the instructions which I am about to give unto you, for all those who have this law revealed unto them must obey the same. For behold, I reveal unto you a new and an everlasting covenant, and if ye abide not that covenant, then are ye damned, for no one can reject this covenant and be permitted to enter into my glory." D&C 132:2-4. The reasons for plural marriage now consisted of more than just having another family if the first wife was barren, having a large posterity, or saving women from a lonely life or prostitution. The Lord announced that it was to be his law. He explained that Sarah gave Hagar to Abraham to wife. And why did she do it? Because this was the law. D&C 132-34. Within this single section of the Doctrine and Covenants, the Lord mentions plural marriage as his law 32 times and explains clearly that it is a law of the holy priesthood. See verses 28, 45-46, 58, 61. Within this 1843 revelation there are many forceful and positive statements in favor of living plural marriage, i.e., all those who have this law revealed unto them must obey the same. v3. And if ye abide not that covenant, then are ye damned. v4. No one can reject this covenant and be permitted to enter into my glory. v4. All who will have a blessing at my hand shall abide the law which was appointed for that blessing. v5. He that receiveth the fullness thereof must and shall abide the law. v6. I give unto you this commandment. v12. No man shall come unto the Father but by me or by my word, which is my law. v12. These angels did not abide my law, therefore, they cannot be enlarged, but remain separately and singly, without exaltation, in their saved condition, to all eternity. v17. They cannot, therefore, inherit my glory. v18. If a man marry a wife by my word, which is my law. It shall be said unto them, ye shall come forth. And shall inherit thrones, kingdoms, principalities and powers, dominions, all heights and depths. In time, and through all eternity. v19. Which glory shall be a fullness and a continuation of the seeds forever and ever. v19. Then shall they be gods. Because all things are subject to them. v20. Except ye abide my law ye cannot attain to this glory. v21. This is eternal lives, to know the only wise and true God, and Jesus Christ. Receive ye, therefore, my law. v24. He that abideth not this law can in no wise enter into my glory, but shall be damned. v27. This promise is yours also, because ye are of Abraham, and the promise was made unto Abraham, and by this law is the continuation of the works of my Father. v31. Go ye, therefore, and do the works of Abraham, enter ye into my law, and ye shall be saved. v32. Whatsoever you seal on earth shall be sealed in heaven. v46. I will magnify my name upon all those who receive and abide in my law. v64. D&C Sec. 132. These are only a few of the reasons for plural marriage, and for the next several years, hundreds of sermons would present additional reasons. Personal revelations on plural marriage were also received by individuals, such as Abraham Hunsaker. Picture of Hunsaker. When the law of celestial marriage was first whispered to him, he opposed it, exclaiming, "It is of the devil," but God knew his heart, and an open day a messenger from heaven with 3 women clothed in white raiment, stood before him several feet from the ground, and addressed him thus. You never can receive a full and complete salvation in my kingdom, unless your garments are pure and white, and you have 3 counselors like me. Thus he was convinced that the principle was right, and he subsequently married 5 wives, and he became the father of 50 children. Jensen's Biographical Encyclopedia 3 415. 1844. Opposition to the law of plural marriage increased, as well as the persecutions of Joseph Smith. Conspiracies plotting his death were no secret to him. They accuse me of polygamy, and of being a false prophet, and many other things which I do not now remember, but I am no false prophet, I am no impostor, I have had no dark revelations, I have had no revelations from the devil, I made no revelations, I have got nothing up of myself. The same God that has thus far dictated me and directed me and strengthened me in this work, gave me this revelation and commandment on celestial and plural marriage, and the same God commanded me to obey it. He said to me that unless I accepted it and introduced it, and practiced it, I, together with my people, would be damned and cut off from this time henceforth. And they say if I do so, they will kill me. Oh, what shall I do? If I do not practice it, I shall be damned with my people. If I do teach it, and practice it, and urge it, they say they will kill me, and I know they will. But said he, we have got to observe it. It is an eternal principle and was given by way of commandment, and not by way of instruction. Contributor 5259. In June he was killed. 1852. Because of his knowledge on the subject, Orson Pratt was selected to introduce the revelation and the doctrine of plural marriage to the church on August 19, 1852. His special conference address was the first public sermon on the subject. I think, if I am not mistaken, that the Constitution gives the privilege to all the inhabitants of this country, of the free exercise of their religious notions, and the freedom of their faith, and the practice of it. Then, if it can be proven to a demonstration that the Latter-day Saints have actually embraced, as a part and portion of their religion, the doctrine of a plurality of wives, it is constitutional. And should there ever be laws enacted by this government to restrict them from the free exercise of this part of their religion, such laws must be unconstitutional. Mill. Star Sup. 1518. Brigham Young then addressed the saints on the same subject and called for a vote. It was accepted by the members of the church as a revelation from the Lord. 2 weeks after this announcement, Orson Pratt was sent to Washington, D.C., to publicly announce it through the seer to the United States as a tenet of the LDS faith. The American public was generally against it at the outset, and from then on opposition and persecution increased. 1853. Elder John Taylor was sent to New York to establish a newspaper called The Mormon, and through its pages, defend the principle and practice of plural marriage. Elder Erastus Snow was called to St. Louis to publish the St. Louis Luminary for the same purpose, and George Q. Cannon went to San Francisco to print the Western Standard. The elders in England published similar defenses in the Journal of Discourses and Millennial Star. Beginning in great secrecy, plural marriage was now being proclaimed with great fanfare. 1855. The Mormon Endowment House, completed on Temple Square in 1855, was used for more than 30 years for polygamous marriage ceremonies. Picture of Endowment House. 1857. When the Christians, with all their scriptures and rebuttals, failed to defeat the Mormons, the federal government sent out their best trained, best equipped and best prepared army to put down the Mormons. John Taylor said, "We had men in all the camps and knew what was intended. Beauty and booty were their watchwords. We were to have another grand Mormon conquest, and our houses, gardens, orchards, vineyards, fields, wives and daughters were to be the spoils." CHC 4259. The Mormons received still more lessons on charity from the Christian monogamists. This anti-polygamy program cost the U.S. government $44 million, and they didn't even achieve the victory they wanted. 1862. The Gentiles tried to break up the Mormons with mobs, with their Bibles, and a militarized army. Having failed with that, they now employed lawyers to make laws against them. On July 8, 1862, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Morrill Anti-Bigamy Act into law. It provided for a penalty of $500 fine and 5 years imprisonment for polygamous Mormons. It disincorporated the church and limited their holdings to $50,000. The Mormons constantly tried to become a state, but were repeatedly refused. Yet during the Civil War, the U.S. government went to war against some of the other states, trying to keep them in the Union. 1865. Some Mormons thought the church should receive another revelation revoking the law of plural marriage. Brigham Young Jr. responded by saying, "There is no halfway house. The childish babble about another revelation is only an evidence how half-informed men can talk. The Mormons have either to spurn their religion and their God, and sink self-damned in the eyes of all civilization at the moment when most blessed in the practice of their faith, or go calmly on to the same issue which they have always had, Mormonism in its entirety, the revelation of God, or nothing at all." Brigham Young Jr., editor, Mill. Star 27676, October 28, 1865. 1870. A number of meetings were held by several thousand women protesting the anti-polygamy Cragen and Cullum bills. They wrote, "Resolved, that we consider the above-named bills foul blots on our national escutcheon and absurd documents, atrocious insults to the honorable executive of the United States government, and malicious attempts to subvert the right of civil and religious liberty. Essentials in Church Hist. Joes. FLDG. Smith, page 444. 1871. Judge McKean made some absurd rulings in the naturalization of foreigners, making their belief in polygamy a test question." Church Chronology, Jensen, February 1871. The Salt Lake County authorities arrested a number of prostitutes, who subsequently were released by federal officials. Church Chronology, Jensen, December 1871, page 84. 1872. President Brigham Young was in the 3rd District Court, but his case was continued until March. Judge McKean refused $500,000 bail for him, and the president was again guarded in his own house by U.S. deputy marshals. Ibid. January 2, 1872, page 84. 1874. In 1874, Congress passed the Pollen Bill, which repealed certain Utah statutes. It partially fulfilled the clamoring of the radical anti-Mormon element because it curtailed the civil and political rights of the Mormon people, giving more authority to federal judges and officers. 1875. Judge McKean again put press. Young under an indictment when one of his wives sued him for divorce and alimony. The judge was so eager for this case that he gave Annalisa the status of a legal wife and decided against Brigham, ordering him to pay her alimony of $10,000. When Brigham failed to pay, sentence was passed upon him on March 11, 1875, and he was sent to the Utah State Penitentiary for 24 hours. George Reynolds, the private secretary to Brigham Young, was chosen to be a test case where they could follow through with the court system to prove that plural marriage was legal under the Constitution and First Amendment. The law being tested was the 1862 Bigamy law, and Reynolds voluntarily appeared in court, giving himself up for trial. In spite of all the legal arguments for his defense, he was convicted and sentenced to 1 year in prison and a $500 fine. An appeal was then taken to the Supreme Court of the territory, where it was dismissed on the ground that the grand jury which heard the indictment was an illegal jury. Reynolds was set up for another trial in 1875, when Judge Alexander White was more harsh than the previous judge, sentencing him to $500 fine and 2 years in the penitentiary at hard labor. The Supreme Court confirmed the verdict, and an appeal was taken to Washington. The ladies of Utah sent a petition having 23,626 signatures to Congress, praying for the admission of Utah into the Union as a state and the repeal of the anti-polygamy laws. Church Chronology, Jensen, December 1875. 1878. The George Reynolds test case went before the Supreme Court, where the question is raised whether religious belief can be accepted as a justification of an overt act made criminal by the law of the land. Reynolds v. United States, page 162, but the question should have seen, can politicians be justified in the overt act of making laws prohibiting the free exercise of religion? Under a new law, 12 Stat. 501, plural marriage was made a crime in the territory. The humorous part was that this was done because of the evil consequences that were supposed to flow from plural marriages. Ibid. Page 168, they completely failed to look at the consequences that flowed from monogamy. Right in their own front yard was all the evidence they needed. 1879. At the funeral of William Clayton, one of Joseph Smith's close associates, Joseph F. Smith, spoke and said, "This doctrine of plural marriage is one of the most important doctrines ever revealed to man. Without it man would come to a full stop. Without it we never could be exalted to associate with and become gods, neither could we attain to the power of eternal increase. There are, however, enough witnesses to these principles to establish them upon the earth in such a manner that they never can be forgotten or stamped out. For they will live, they are destined to live, and also to grow and spread abroad upon the face of the earth, to be received and accepted and adopted by all the virtuous, by all the pure in heart, by all who love the truth, and seek to serve him and keep his commandments. They are bound to prevail, because they are true principles." J.D. 2110. 1880. During the period of the extreme and unrelenting prosecutions under the Anti-Polygamy Acts of Congress, President Woodruff spent much of the time among the churches in Arizona and southern Utah. On January 26, 1880, having retired for some days in the mountains fasting and praying, he obtained important revelations from the Lord concerning the work of the 12 apostles and events which would happen, affecting both the church and the nations. These were submitted to President John Taylor and the Council of the Apostles, and were accepted by them as profitable for doctrine, for comfort, for light as to the future, and for encouragement in the work of the ministry. Imp. Era 1874. Since the saints were suffering such perilous times because of plural marriage, this revelation of 1880 was very important to them. In it the Lord said to them, "The devil is ruling over his kingdom, and my spirit has no place in the hearts of the rulers of this nation, and the devil stirs them up to defy my power, and to make war upon my saints. Therefore let mine apostles and mine elders who are faithful obey my commandments, which are already written for their profit and guidance. As I have said in former commandments, it is not my will that mine elders should fight the battles of Zion, for I will fight your battles. This nation is ripened in iniquity, and the cup of the wrath of mine indignation is full, and I will not stay my hand in judgments upon this nation or the nations of the earth. And I say again, woe unto that nation or house or people who seek to hinder my people from obeying the patriarchal law of Abraham, which leadeth to celestial glory, which has been revealed unto my saints through the mouth of my servant Joseph, for whosoever doeth these things shall be damned, saith the Lord of hosts, and shall be broken up and wasted away from under heaven by the judgments which I have sent forth, and which shall not return unto me void. Thus saith the Lord unto you, my servants and apostles who dwell in the flesh. Fear ye not your enemies. Let not your hearts be troubled. I am in your midst. I am your advocate with the Father. Revelations, 1880-1890, Comp. By Kraut, pages 7-12. Regardless of all the laws of the land that had been passed against polygamy, the Lord continued to exhort, persuade and command his people to obey his law of plural or celestial marriage. The whole question, therefore, narrows itself to this in the Mormon mind. Polygamy was revealed by God, or the entire fabric of their faith is false. To ask them to give up such an item of belief is to ask them to relinquish the whole, to acknowledge their priesthood a lie, their ordinances a deception, and all that they have toiled for, lived for, bled for, prayed for, or hoped for, a miserable failure and a waste of life. S.L. Telegraph, Brigham Young Jr., 28 October 1880, Mill. Star 27 673. 1881. Christian representatives wanted war with the Mormons. They wanted to see the Mormons killed, their property taken away and their religion wiped out. The Reverend J.H. Peters, at Dayton, in October 1881, said, "I would that the guns of Fort Douglas were turned upon them, the Mormons, and they made loyal by this means if by no other." Ibid. Page 482, such were the feelings of most of the Christian people of America. They were Christians by name and Romans at heart. 1882. This year saw the passage of the Edmunds Law which reads, "Every person who has a husband or wife living, who marries more than one woman, is guilty of polygamy, and shall be punished by a fine of not more than $500, and by imprisonment for a term of not more than 5 years. Section 1. This law prohibited a polygamist from voting or holding any public office, and anyone under suspect was made to sign a test oath. A few centuries before, the Inquisition brought all the forces of law and imprisonment against faithful Christians. Now the Christians were imposing the same on the Mormons. They were being forced to sign a modern test oath or suffer the consequences. A portion of that oath stated, "I further swear that I am not a bigamist, polygamist, or living in unlawful cohabitation, or associating or cohabiting polygamously with persons of the other sex." Immediately following the passage of the worst law against plural marriage so far, the Lord gave another revelation in support of plural marriage, i.e., "Thus saith the Lord to the 12, and to the priesthood and people of my church. Let my servants George Teasdale and Heber J. Grant be appointed to fill the vacancies in the 12, that you may be fully organized and prepared for the labors devolving upon you, for you have a great work to perform, and then proceed to fill up the presiding quorum of 70s. And assist in organizing that body of my priesthood who are your co-laborers in the ministry. You may appoint Seymour B. Young to fill up the vacancy in the presiding quorum of 70s, if he will conform to my law. For it is not meet that men who will not abide my law, plural marriage, shall preside over my priesthood." Revelation to John Taylor, October 13, 1882, Revelations 1880-1890, Kraut, page 35. How interesting. As the government made laws against plural marriage, the Lord reinforced his commands to obey it. There could be no compromise. John Taylor suggested that it would be well for us to keep up our coat collars and protect ourselves as best we could until the storm passed over. Life of John Taylor, B. H. Roberts, page 360. In this revelation of 1882 was a new law pertaining to plural marriage that only polygamists could preside over the priesthood. In other words, a monogamist should not serve as a general authority in the church. Other supportive information and positive statements soon followed from leading church brethren, such as, concerning the patriarchal order of marriage, President Taylor said, "If we do not embrace that principle soon, the keys will be turned against us. If we do not keep the same law that our Heavenly Father has kept, we cannot go with him. A man obeying a lower law is not qualified to preside over those who keep a higher law." In harmony with the remarks of President Taylor, Elder Woodruff observed, "The reason why the Church and Kingdom of God cannot advance without the patriarchal order of marriage is that it belongs to this dispensation, just as baptism for the dead does, or any law or ordinance that belongs to a dispensation. Without it the Church cannot progress. The leading men of Israel who are presiding over stakes will have to obey the law of Abraham, or they will have to resign." Life of Wilford Woodruff, Matthew Cowley, page 542. The following precepts for this law of marriage had now been established. 1. Men must live it or the keys will be turned against them. 2. If they want to go where Heavenly Father is, they must obey it. 3. A man living monogamy cannot preside over a polygamist. 4. It belongs to this dispensation. 5. The church cannot progress without it. 6. Stake presidents must live it or resign. 1885. Prosecutions continued as federal officials paid rewards and bribes for information on cohabs. Many polygamists were imprisoned, went into hiding, or moved to Mexico. In President John Taylor's last public address, February 1, 1885, he said, "These are precious principles which only the saints know how to comprehend and appreciate. We are told that the natural man perceiveth not the things of God, neither can he know them, for they are spiritually discerned. And therefore those outside of that influence and spirit which is communicated to the saints of the Most High, through obedience to the gospel of the Son of God, find it very difficult to understand them. But we comprehend them, because God has given unto us his Spirit, which takes of the things of God and shows them unto us." JD 26 148-149. Shortly after this time, an editorial appeared in the Deseret News, undoubtedly the work of press. John Taylor, because Charles Penrose, editor, was in England at the time. It stated, "What would be necessary to bring about the result nearest the hearts of the opponents of Mormonism, more properly termed the gospel of the Son of God? Simply to renounce, abrogate or apostatize from the new and everlasting covenant of marriage in its fullness. Were the church to do that as an entirety, God would reject the saints as a body. The authority of the priesthood would be withdrawn, with its gifts and powers, and there would be no more heavenly recognition of the ministrations among the people. The heavens would permanently withdraw themselves, and the Lord would raise up another people of greater valor and stability, for his work must, according to his unalterable decrees, go forward, for the time of the second coming of the Savior is near, even at the doors." Day. Eve. News, editorial, April 23, 1885. What an indictment against monogamy in church leadership. Consider the gravity of this editorial. 1. To renounce plural marriage was apostasy. 2. If the church did that, God would reject them as a body. 3. The authority of the priesthood would be withdrawn. 4. Spiritual gifts would disappear. 5. The heavens would be withdrawn and no more revelations given. 6. Another people would be called to continue to obey that law. A grand mass meeting was held in the Tabernacle, Salt Lake City, to protest against the oppressive course of the federal officials in the territory. A declaration of grievances and protest, addressed to the President and people of the United States, were adopted, and John T. Kane, John W. Taylor, and John Q. Cannon were chosen as a delegation to proceed to Washington with the documents. Similar mass meetings were held in the various cities and towns of the territory. Church Chronology, Jensen, May 2, 1885. Why would the Lord and the leaders of the church be opposed to these Gentile anti-polygamy laws of the land? That was explained in another editorial in the Deseret News. What constitutes a genuine law of the land? This can be commensurately answered by stating the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and all statutes made in conformity with its provisions, in letter and spirit, are genuine laws. Those which conflict with it according to that proposition are not. The Edmunds Act is grossly unconstitutional, and therefore is not essentially a law of the land in the true sense of the term, because it is an infringement on constitutional privileges, being ex post facto, a bill of attainder, and a curtailment of religious liberty. If it were a constitutional law, there would be no conflict between it and the revelation on celestial marriage. There being a clash, there is no alternative but to sustain what God has given. Day. Eve. News, editorial, June 5, 1885. The judges and juries in territorial courts were anything but fair and impartial. For example, Judge Zane, in his instructions to the grand jury, interpreted the law in such a way that persons found guilty of unlawful cohabitation could be imprisoned for life. September 16, 1885, Church Chron. Jensen, page 17. After 2 days' trial in the First District Court at Ogden, the jury returned a verdict of guilty against Lorenzo Snow for unlawful cohabitation in 1885, notwithstanding the evidence introduced had proven him innocent. December 31, 1885, Ibid. Page 24. 1886. The Mormons were now placed in the critical position of either allowing the Lord to protect them and fight their battles, or compromising and giving in to their enemies. This was clearly the proposition stated to them by Lorenzo Snow, who said in court, 50 millions of people are said to be calling loudly for the extermination of the Mormons. If it be a fact that our religion is divine, established of God, there is no cause for alarm, nor even anxiety or uneasiness. Tens of thousands, through obedience to the sacred gospel, know it to be true, a fact by immediate revelation to themselves. Therefore, these 50 millions of people are not fighting the Mormons or their religion, but they are fighting God and his purposes. Israel, on the banks of the Red Sea, were God's people, a fact perfectly known to Moses, and he knew, also, what were the purposes of God concerning them. Hence, there was no occasion for alarm or anxiety in view of the overwhelming forces of Pharaoh's army, threatening immediate annihilation. God's eye was upon Israel. They were there by his direction, a fact, a revealed fact, known to Moses and Aaron, and doubtless to many others, by direct communication from God. It is true, they were placed in a frightful situation naturally, a hopeless one, from which no human power or ability could extricate them. Israel was there, not from choice, but by the command of God, and he had arranged his own program, yet Pharaoh with his armed hosts sought to thwart his purposes, and in the end was overthrown and destroyed. And the result of this ignorance and folly stands recorded on the pages of history as a lesson to all generations. The prosecuting attorney was quite mistaken in saying the defendant Mr. Snow was the most scholarly and brightest light of the apostles, and equally wrong when pleading with the jury to assist him and the United States of America in convicting Apostle Snow. And he would predict that a new revelation would soon follow, changing the divine law of celestial marriage. Whatever fame Mr. Bierbauer may have secured as a lawyer, he certainly will fail as a prophet. The severest prosecutions have never been followed by revelations changing a divine law, obedience to which brought imprisonment or martyrdom. Though I go to prison, God will not change his law of celestial marriage. Mill. Star 48 110-111, February 1886. At this critical juncture a resolution, or form of manifesto, was presented to President John Taylor. In reality, it was a minor compromise, thought to lessen the political pressure from off the church. It was suggested that the president take it before the Lord for his approval. In answer, another revelation was received from the Lord. My son John, you have asked me concerning the new and everlasting covenant and how far it is binding upon my people. Thus saith the Lord. All commandments that I give must be obeyed by those calling themselves by my name, unless they are revoked by me or by my authority. And how can I revoke an everlasting covenant? For I the Lord am everlasting, and my everlasting covenants cannot be abrogated, nor done away with, but they stand forever. Nevertheless, I the Lord do not change, and my word and my covenants and my law do not. I have not revoked this law, nor will I, for it is everlasting, and those who will enter into my glory must obey the conditions thereof. Even so, Amen. Revelations 1880-1890 Kraut, pages 54-55, also Douglas Todd Journal, September 1, 1934. Frequently asked questions were: does federal agency have the right of jurisdiction over religion? Do the laws of man take precedence over the laws of God? Once again, an editorial in the Deseret News clearly answers these questions. Any religious society or individual that views a law of man as superior to a law of God proclaims his own hypocrisy. That which is divine must be supreme. Only what deity recognizes is valid in religion. And he who truly believes in God will be willing to obey him in all things, as the highest and greatest of all powers and authorities, in heaven or on earth, in time or in eternity. Day. Eve. News, editorial, December 31, 1886. 1887. Every possible means was being used for the attempted destruction of the Mormon Church, wrote Charles Penrose, adding that what mobs failed to do in Missouri and Illinois, and what ministers of all denominations have been unable to accomplish anywhere, legislators, judges and lawyers are now trying to achieve in Washington and in Utah. Day. Eve. News, February 26, 1887. He was referring to another act called the Edmunds-Tucker Act, the worst, most unconstitutional and unreasonable law that Congress ever conceived. It made the following stipulations. 1. Dissolved the corporation of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as a legal entity. 2. Made husband and wife a competent witness. 3. Caused forfeiture and escheatment of all church property, both real and personal, in excess of $50,000 to the federal government, the property to be disposed of, and the proceeds to be used for the benefit of the district schools of Utah. 4. Dissolved the Perpetual Emigrating Company and escheated its resources to the federal government, to be disposed of and used as were those of the church. 5. Prohibited the chartering of any corporation similar in nature or intent to the Perpetual Emigrating Company. 6. Abolished woman suffrage in Utah. 7. Disinherited polygamous issue. 8. Provided for complete disfranchisement of polygamists by test oath. A. They could not vote. B. They could not sit on juries. C. They could not hold public office. 9. Placed all law enforcement, judicial and militia power in the Utah Commission or other federal appointees. 10. Suspended territorial school laws. 11. Required certification and registration of all marriages in the probate court. Day. News, March 3, 1887. The Constitution was meant to protect people and their religious rights, but with the passage of the Edmunds-Tucker Act, such protection was denied. Persecution replaced protection. America was founded and the Constitution created to guarantee freedom of religion, but evil politicians became as venomous and corrupt as those in the European nations from which they had fled. The effects of this law not only changed the condition of the church, but also the thinking of many Mormons. The defenders of plural marriage were succumbing to the onslaughts of the Gentiles, as was manifest in their proposal for a new state constitution. June of this year witnessed another attempt, the fifth of its kind, to secure for Utah the boon of statehood. The movement was especially notable from the fact that it was proposed by the Mormons, the Gentiles, refusing to take any part in the proceedings to insert in the state constitution an article prohibiting and punishing polygamy. The Constitutional Convention assembled at the City Hall, Salt Lake City, on the 30th of June. 69 delegates were present from nearly all counties. Whitney's History of Utah, 3,583. The state constitution was framed and adopted with the following provision. Section 12 of Article 15. Bigamy and polygamy being considered incompatible with a republican form of government, each of them is hereby forbidden and declared a misdemeanor. Any person who shall violate this section shall, on conviction thereof, be punished by a fine of not more than $1,000 and by imprisonment for a term of not less than 6 months, nor more than 3 years, in the discretion of the court. Ibid. 3,584. This may not have had anything to do with the untimely death of President John Taylor, living in exile, but he passed away a little over 2 weeks later. The election occurred on Monday, the 1st of August. The count of the votes cast showed the following result. For the Constitution 13,195. Against the Constitution 502. Ibid. 3,585. The saints were becoming as pernicious as their persecutors. These were Mormons voting for a constitution that declared plural marriage a crime. This occurred only 1 year after John Taylor said the Lord revealed to him that the Latter-day Saints would soon give up plural marriage. The Mormons didn't even wait for the manifesto 3 years later. The great majority had already turned against plural marriage. 1889. Pandemonium reigned supreme in the land of the Mormons. The church had lost millions of dollars in property and businesses. Families were broken up with many leading men in the underground or in prison. Mormon polygamists were considered aliens if not enemies by the government. Local businessmen and bankers were crying to the church leaders to make a concession or compromise, or to abandon polygamy by some form of manifesto. President Woodruff once again went to the Lord, and according to Abraham Cannon and others, a revelation was received. Cannon wrote an interesting account in his journal. Sunday evening, November 24, 1889. Propositions had been made for the church to make some concessions to the courts in regard to its principles. Both of press. Woodruff's counselors refused to advise him as to the course he should pursue, and he therefore laid the matter before the Lord. The answer came quick and strong. The word of the Lord was for us not to yield one particle of that which he had revealed and established. He had done and would continue to care for his work and those of the saints who were faithful, and we need have no fear of our enemies when we were in the line of our duty. We are promised redemption and deliverance if we will trust in God and not in the arm of flesh. We were admonished to read and study the Word of God and to pray often. The whole revelation was filled with words of the greatest encouragement and comfort, and my heart was filled with joy and peace during the entire reading. It sets all doubts at rest concerning the course to pursue. Journal of Abraham Cannon, December 19, 1889. Parts of the revelation stated, "Let not my servants who are called to the presidency of my church deny my word or my law, which concerns the salvation of the children of men. Place not yourselves in jeopardy to your enemies by promise. Let my servants who officiate as your counselors before the courts make their pleadings as they are moved upon by the Holy Spirit, without any further pledges from my priesthood. I, the Lord, will hold the courts, with the officers of government in the nation, responsible for their acts towards the inhabitants of Zion. Awake, O Israel, and have faith in God and his promises, and he will not forsake you. I cannot deny my word, neither in blessings nor judgments." Messages of the First Presidency, Clark, 3,176, also Gospel Doctrine Manual, Thy Kingdom Shall Roll Forth 1979, page 58. 1890. 10 months after receiving this powerful revelation of 1889, Wilford Woodruff wrote in his private journal, "After feeling inspired by his spirit, I have issued the following proclamation. Inasmuch as laws have been enacted by Congress forbidding plural marriages. I hereby declare my intention to submit to those laws and to use my influence with the members of the church over which I preside to have them do likewise." September 25, 1889, entry. No revelation was ever entered in his journal supporting his official declaration, nor has one ever been published or found in church archives. It should be remembered at this point that in the 1880 revelation he received, the Lord had said, "Woe unto that nation or house or people, who seek to hinder my people from obeying the patriarchal law of Abraham, which leadeth to a celestial glory, which has been revealed unto my saints through the mouth of my servant Joseph, for whosoever doeth these things shall be damned." January 26, 1880, W. Woodruff journal entry. Thus, in 1880, Woodruff received a revelation saying woe to any people that hinder his people from living plural marriage. Then 10 years later he signed a manifesto saying, "I hereby declare my intention to submit to those laws against plural marriage and to use my influence with the members of the church over which I preside to have them do likewise." Official declaration, at end of the DNC. After the manifesto of 1890 was issued, the government and its citizens reversed their position and ceased to persecute the polygamists. The church also reversed their stand. Instead of defending plural marriage, they began to prosecute, persecute and excommunicate those who still lived it. The consequence of such actions would have a devastating effect on one's salvation, according to Heber C. Kimball, who had once warned, "Let the presidency of this church, and the 12 apostles, and all the authorities unite and say with one voice that they will oppose that doctrine, and the whole of them would be damned." What are you opposing it for? It is a principle that God has revealed for the salvation of the human family. J.D. 5203. 1891. The manifesto had been signed and now church members asked to be pardoned. Church leaders wrote a letter to the President of the United States, in which they made a petition for amnesty. The President of the United States. "We, the First Presidency and Apostles of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, beg to respectfully represent Your Excellency the following facts. We formerly taught to our people that polygamy or celestial marriages commanded by God through Joseph Smith was right, that it was a necessity to man's highest exaltation in the life to come. That doctrine was publicly promulgated by our president, the late Brigham Young, 40 years ago, and was steadily taught and impressed upon the Latter-day Saints up to September 1890. The government added disfranchisement to its other punishment for those who clung to their faith and fulfilled its covenants. To be at peace with the government and in harmony with their fellow citizens who are not of their faith. Our people have voluntarily put aside something which all their lives they have believed to be a sacred principle." Smoot Case Proceedings, 118, also Contributor 13-196. 1896. Utah became a state with their own state constitution through the Enabling Act. The constitution was framed with a toleration of religious sentiment included. First, perfect toleration of religious sentiment is guaranteed. No inhabitant of this state shall ever be molested in person or property on account of his or her mode of religious worship, but polygamous or plural marriages are forever prohibited. This was clearly a contradiction of terms, and it still stands on the pages of our Utah Constitution. 1904. On April 6, 1904, Joseph F. Smith issued what later became known as the Second Manifesto, wherein he stated, "I, Joseph F. Smith, President of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, hereby affirm and declare that no such marriages have been solemnized with the sanction, consent or knowledge of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. If any officer or member of the church shall assume to solemnize or enter into any such marriage, he will be deemed in transgression against the church, and will be liable to be dealt with, according to the rules and regulations thereof, and excommunicated therefrom." Mess. Of First Press. 484. Francis M. Lyman then presented this manifesto to the General Conference attendees for their adoption, which they eagerly did. Michael Quinn referred to the importance of this document in a widely circulated article published 10 years ago. On 6 April 1904, Joseph F. Smith presented his official statement for the vote of the General Conference. A polygamist confidant of both President Smith and Senator Smoot told the senator's secretary that the Second Manifesto had a hidden meaning. The new manifesto modifies that of 1890 by eliminating unlawful cohabitation. Unlawful cohabitation now has the sanction of the church, though the people did not know what they were doing in adopting it. Mess. Of First Press. 484-85, despite the Second Manifesto's unqualified denial of post-manifesto polygamy, the circumstances of its ratification by the General Conference also sent another message to those who were already aware of what had been happening on and off for more than 13 years. LDS Church Authority and New Plural Marriages, 1890-1904 D. Michael Quinn, Dialogue 18-1, Spring 1985. 1931. After many little manifestos, the so-called Third Manifesto was issued by Heber J. Grant, and it was even more effective in trying to put an end to plural marriages once and for all within the church. It wholeheartedly supported the arrest and conviction of all polygamists. We have been, however, and we are entirely willing and anxious too that such offenders against the law of the state should be dealt with and punished as the law provides. We have been and we are willing to give such legal assistance as we legitimately can in the criminal prosecution of such cases. We are willing to go to such limits not only because we regard it as our duty as citizens of the country to assist in the enforcement of the law and the suppression of pretended plural marriages, but also because we wish to do everything humanly possible to make our attitude toward this matter so clear, definite, and unequivocal as to leave no possible doubt of it in the mind of any person. Mess. Of First Press. 5/292-93. I would like all those in this congregation who feel to sustain this statement that I have read to you to manifest it as the apostles and all of the general authorities have done, by raising their right hands. The congregation responded by raising their hands. I have never seen such a lot of hands held so high in my life. All those who are opposed to this statement will please raise their hands. No hands were raised. Our enemies do not seem to be here. I bid. 5/297. 1935. It is said that J. Reuben Clark and Hugh B. Brown, both lawyers, worked on a bill, H.B. number 224, which made polygamy a felony the only state in the Union, giving it such a severe classification, and this in a state founded and settled by polygamists. No other principle of the gospel has been so complex and controversial. At one time it was considered a most holy law of God that men would die for, then later, according to James E. Talmage, plurality of wives was an incident, never an essential. Story of Mormonism, page 86, but according to Brigham Young, the doctrine of polygamy with the Mormons is not one of the kind that in the religious world is classed with non-essentials. It is not an item of doctrine that can be yielded, and faith in the system remain. The whole question, therefore, narrows itself to this in the Mormon mind. Polygamy was revealed by God, or the entire fabric of their faith is false. To ask them to give up such an item of belief is to ask them to relinquish the whole, to acknowledge their priesthood a lie, their ordinances a deception, and all they have toiled for, lived for, bled for, prayed for, or hoped for, a miserable failure and a waste of life. Mill. Star 27-673. Giving up plural marriage, opposing it, supporting the prosecution of polygamists and considering them enemies, is one thing, but achieving the blessings promised to those who live it is another. Obedience to a law and opposition to that law cannot render the same reward. In 1878 Joseph F. Smith stated, "Some people have supposed that the doctrine of plural marriage was sort of superfluity, or non-essential to the salvation or exaltation of mankind. In other words, some of the saints have said and believe that a man with one wife, sealed to him by the authority of the priesthood for time and eternity, will receive an exaltation as great and glorious, if he is faithful, as he possibly could with more than one. I want here to enter my solemn protest against this idea, for I know it is false. The marriage of one woman to a man for time and eternity by the sealing power, according to the law of God, is a fulfillment of the celestial law of marriage in part. But this is only the beginning of the law, not the whole of it. Therefore, whoever has imagined that he could obtain the fullness of the blessings pertaining to this celestial law by complying with only a portion of its conditions has deceived himself. He cannot do it. It is useless to tell me that there is no blessing attached to obedience to the law, polygamy, or that a man with only one wife can obtain as great reward, glory or kingdom as he can with more than one, being equally faithful. Patriarchal marriage involves conditions, responsibilities and obligations. Man cannot receive the fullness of the blessings unless he fulfills the law, any more than he can claim the gift of the Holy Ghost after he is baptized without the laying on of hands by the proper authority, or the remission of sins without baptism. I understand the law of celestial marriage to mean that every man in this church, who has the ability to obey and practice it in righteousness, and will not, shall be damned. I say I understand it to mean this and nothing less, and I testify in the name of Jesus that it does mean that. JD 20. 28-31. Most church members in our day live with a half-hearted, partially converted, poor understanding of the gospel. They obey part of the laws, but expect the blessings for living them all. But, can a person work half a day and expect a full day's pay? Can you expect to continually buy something of value for half of its worth? The fullness of the gospel is not a McDonald's hamburger, but rather a full-course dinner requiring a full-price payment. The history of Mormon polygamy is a paradox and absolute contradiction in principle and practice. For 40 years it was taught that the doctrine of plural and celestial marriage is the most holy and important doctrine ever revealed to man on the earth, and that without obedience to that principle, no man can ever attain to the fullness of exaltation in celestial glory. Hist. Record 6-227. Then for the next 100 years it was considered to be a serious sin and a felony. Those who lived it were accused of living in adultery, have sold their souls to Satan, and whether their acts are based on ignorance or lust or both, they will be damned in eternity. Mormon Doctrine, 1st edition, Bruce R. McConkie, page 523. Why would God tell people they must live this most holy principle up to September 25, 1890, and then the next day begin the inconsistent program of telling them it was a terrible adulterous evil for which they could be thrown out of his church, and even be damned? One apostle understood the importance of plural marriage to mean that we should in this regard place ourselves in the same position as that of the 3 Hebrews who were cast into the fiery furnace. Heber J. Grant, Day. News, April 4, 1885. Yet another apostle said, "We do not understand why the Lord commanded the practice of plural marriage." John A. Widsoe, Imp. Era 4691. Every Latter-day Saint is under the obligation of determining whether plural marriage is right or wrong, because if there is anything virtuous, lovely, or of good report or praiseworthy, we seek after these things. 13th Article of Faith, we should recognize that when obeyed and lived correctly, plural marriage can certainly fall into that category. Chapter 16. Conclusion. A principle, ordinance, covenant and law. It has been very interesting and informative to see how many nations have benefited from their acceptance of a plural marriage lifestyle. Several non-Christian nations, such as China and India, and some in the Near East, such as Arabia, Syria, Persia and Africa, have, on the whole, had less immorality than the so-called Christian nations who have not accepted such a lifestyle. The Bible records that for thousands of years prophets, patriarchs, priests, and kings obeyed and lived polygamy. All the tribes of Israel, including the Jews, accepted it, and God chose this polygamous lineage through which Jesus was born. Furthermore, the Savior always spoke respectfully of those prophets and people who lived plural marriage, never saying anything against that principle. There is nothing in the Old or New Testament that enforces the law of monogamous marriages, neither is there anything opposing plural marriage. We have seen that the only ancient law enforcing monogamy came from a band of robbers who gradually extended it throughout the Roman Empire and influenced other nations and religions, especially the Christians. What a tragic history, showing how the Christian nations have repeatedly neglected their surplus women, leaving them with illegitimate children, prostitution, disease, or a life of celibacy. We have read how the freedoms and religious rights of Americans have been crushed by the very government established to guarantee these rights, and also how the American government and the Christian religions have betrayed, corrupted and violated their most sacred oaths and covenants. We have studied the calamity of Mormonism's plural marriage system and how men in the church struggled, defended and even died for it, but later the hierarchy turned to prosecute and excommunicate those who taught or lived it. Throughout all this, we have learned why plural marriage has been lived and respected, and why the Lord has revealed such a principle and commanded it to be lived as a law of the holy priesthood. Let us briefly consider plural marriage in the light of 4 major classifications. 1. A principle and doctrine. 2. An ordinance. 3. A covenant. 4. A law. 1. A principle and doctrine. Population records show that there are always more women than men. Why is this? 1. More male babies die than female. 2. Men often lose their lives in hazardous occupations. 3. Wars claim the lives of thousands of young men. 4. Men's life expectancy is shorter than women's. There are many positive opportunities in plural marriage for this surplus of women. A woman is provided with a chance to marry and to marry any man of her choice. It also provides a better opportunity of marriage for women who might be handicapped, crippled, overweight, homely or sickly. It gives women who are barren a chance to be in a family with children. It gives women more time and independence to pursue vocations, hobbies, individual studies, etc. It can certainly be considered as a true principle with very positive results. But true principles seem to attract opposition. If plural marriage were a sin, the devil wouldn't oppose it so much. As Joseph Smith said, when wicked and corrupt men oppose, it is a criterion to judge if a man is warring the Christian warfare. TPJS, page 259. Plural marriage is meant to be a principle upon which to build a large and righteous family. Only the most noble of men should live it for spiritual reasons. The Lord explained why he blessed Abraham, his family and his children. Seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. For I know him, that he will command his children and his household after him, and they shall keep the way of the Lord to do justice and judgment, that the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he hath spoken of him. Gen. 18:18-19. On the other hand, the people who are the most wicked should not be allowed to have any posterity to perpetuate their wickedness, so in many cases the Lord has caused them to be destroyed. The Sodomites, Canaanites, etc., received the reverse of this blessing. Instead of giving them a multiplicity of wives and children, he cut them off, root and branch, and blotted their name from under heaven, that there might be an end of a race so degenerate. Now this severity was a mercy. If we were like the people before the flood, full of violence and depression, or if we, like the Sodomites or Canaanites, were full of all manner of lawless abominations, holding promiscuous intercourse with the other sex, and stooping to a level with the brute creation, and predisposing our children, by every means in our power, to be fully given to strange and unnatural lusts, appetites, and passions, would it not be a mercy to cut us off, root and branch, and thus put an end to our increase upon the earth? You will all say it would. The spirits in heaven would thank God for preventing them from being born into the world under such circumstances. Would not the spirits in heaven rejoice in the covenant and blessings of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, in relation to the multiplying of their seed, and in every additional wife which God gave to them as a means of multiplying? Yes, they would, for they could say now there is an opportunity for us to take bodies in the lineage of a noble race, and to be educated in the true science of life, and in the commandments of God. Oh, what an unspeakable contrast between being a child of Sodom and a child of Abraham. Parley P. Pratt, J.D. 1 259. 2. An ordinance. An ordinance in this instance is a religious rite or ceremony. New Internal. Dick. Page 889. It is usually performed or administered by someone with authority, and in this study is frequently a duty or commandment from God. It denotes an official acceptance like a signature on a document, thus when obeyed, it shows a person's acceptance of it. Ordinances, such as baptism or marriage, should be obeyed in faith, expecting the fulfillment of the promises connected with it. Joseph Smith spoke very clearly of the importance of God's ordinances. All the ordinances and duties that ever have been required by the priesthood, under the directions and commandments of the Almighty in any of the dispensations, shall all be had in the last dispensation. Without the authority is given, the ordinances could not be administered in righteousness. He set the ordinances to be the same forever and ever. All men will have to receive the fullness of the ordinances of his kingdom, and those who will not receive all the ordinances will come short of the fullness of that glory, if they do not lose the whole. TPJS, pages 171, 172, 168, 309. Plural marriage is one of these ordinances that cannot be changed, it remains the same forever and ever. Thus the blessings pertaining to it cannot be received through any other means. 3. A covenant. A covenant is a binding and solemn agreement, or compact, made by two or more individuals, parties, etc., to do or keep from doing a specified thing. Webster's New World Dick. 1984, page 326. The word covenant is often used interchangeably with contract, which has a very similar definition. An agreement between two or more people to do something, esp. One formally set forth in writing and enforceable by law, compact, covenant, a formal agreement of marriage or betrothal. Ibid. Page 308. If either party breaks his part of that agreement, then the terms of the contract or covenant are no longer valid, whether the agreement is made between mortals or between man and God. There is a penalty and a loss of blessings for breaking a covenant with the Lord, and the more serious the commitment, the more drastic the penalty. The temple ceremony used to be very explicit on the types of penalties that could be incurred when men or women would break certain covenants, and, even though these penalties are no longer explained inside LDS temples today, nevertheless they are still in force when warranted. Breaking temple covenants are among the most serious, as the Lord explained. And it shall come to pass that if you build a house unto my name, and do not do the things that I say, I will not perform the oath which I make unto you, neither fulfill the promises which ye expect at my hands, saith the Lord. For instead of blessings, ye, by your own works, bring cursings, wrath, indignation, and judgments upon your own heads, by your follies, and by all your abominations, which you practice before me, saith the Lord. D&C 124:47-48. A marriage can be a 1. Private, 2. Civil, or 3. Religious contract, but if the marriage covenant is made till death do them part, it ends with the death of either party, because it cannot remain in force when they are dead, and when they are out of the world, therefore, they are not bound. D&C 132:15. Joseph Smith introduced religious wedding ceremonies into the church, and later plural marriages were a part of those covenants which included eternal marriage. These were bound with the power that whatsoever thou shalt bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, Matt. 16:19, which was possible through the power of the holy priesthood. Sometimes a type of covenant is made between a man and woman before they are married, and this is called an engagement. However, going back even further, similar covenants may have been agreed upon even before they were born. This knowledge was revealed to others in addition to the prophet Joseph, such as Emanuel Swedenborg, 1688-1772, a Swedish scientist and spiritualist. In 1743, about 100 years before Joseph Smith had his revelation on plural marriage, Swedenborg claimed to have had a very similar revelation. He wrote, "Two souls which grew up together before life are bound to find each other again on earth. In heaven as on earth there are males and females. Man was made for woman and woman for man. Love must unite them eternally, and there are marriages in heaven." De la Touche, of the Success, page 333. Several important and valid truths are expressed in Swedenborg's revelation. 1. Men and women existed before they were born on earth. 2. They made covenants with each other in that premortal world. 3. They promised to meet each other in this world. 4. Marriage and love can exist forever. More clarifying information was revealed to the early saints, such as Messiah Hancock, who had a vision of our pre-earth life, and was shown the covenants that were made there between men and women. In his vision he saw there was a surplus of women's spirits there as well as here in mortality. No females took part against the Father and the Son, but all took sides in their favor, except the neutral ones already mentioned. After the tears were dried from our eyes, the voice of the great Eternal spoke again and said, "Hear, O ye my children," his voice penetrating the immensity of space, so that all could hear it. "It is decreed by the great Eternal, that the females shall not follow their males in their banishment. But for every male that has kept his first estate and fought valiantly for the Father and the Son, there are 2 females." And the voice of the great Eternal said, "O, my neglected daughters, gather around these my faithful servants who have been faithful in teaching you the principles of righteousness and of our kingdom, that others may come up and have the chance to be glorified." I saw many of them gather around Joseph and form a ring with him and the Savior in the center. They made a covenant with him that they would meet him on the earth and help him establish that great work upon the earth. I saw many of them gather around Brigham Young, John Taylor, Wilford Woodruff, and many other notable ones, and around many who have not become so notable. They formed rings around each of them with Christ in the center each time, for he rehearsed to them the covenant. They would take each other by the hand, in the circle, and bow their faces down to him, in the center, and in the most solemn manner, agree to meet them here, until every one of those neglected daughters was provided for. And they were filled with such joy, that their songs made a paradise of the realm. Messiah Hancock Journal, pages 72-73. Such eternal covenants made between men and women either in the premortal world or this world can be fulfilled only through the powers of the holy priesthood. 4. A law. There is an eternal struggle between good and evil, good laws and bad ones. Most of the ancient prophets suffered and died by the law. Christ also was condemned to death by the law. The Jews answered him, "Pilate, we have a law and by our law he ought to die." John 19:7, the apostles had trouble with laws because some of men's laws were in conflict with the laws of God. Then Peter and the other apostles answered and said, "We ought to obey God rather than men." Acts 5:29. Benefits we receive are generally predicated on obedience to correct law. Disobedience to such laws means a loss, rejection or denial of those benefits or blessings. We have shown that God sustains the law of plural marriage, but usually man's laws have opposed it. The men who make those laws against plural marriage are really inconsistent. They oppose plural marriage, but do little or nothing about men who have sex with many women outside of marriage. In fact, most of them support such immoral practices. Plural marriage is an eternal law of the priesthood, but becomes a law of the church only when accepted as such. Such eternal laws of God have always existed and always will. God himself achieved his position because of obedience to eternal laws. Like the laws of mathematics, chemistry, gravity, science or any truth, they last forever. Circumstances, time or our relationship to them do not change the laws themselves, as B.H. Roberts clearly explained. Suppose a law is promulgated before the Latter-day Saints, a revealed principle of truth is submitted for their acceptance, and then, in the exercise of that liberty, which God has conferred upon his church, they reject it. The question is then asked, what remains? Why, the truth remains. The action of the church has not affected that in the least. It is just as true as if the church had accepted it. Our acceptance or rejection does not make or mar the truth, it simply determines our own relationship to that truth. If we reject the truth still remains. Human conduct does not affect the truth. Defense of the Faith in the Saints, Roberts, 2:518. All laws, man's or God's, should be investigated, studied and tested. One of the ways to do this is to observe their results and fruits. Jesus said, "Every good tree bringeth forth good fruit, but a corrupt tree bringeth forth evil fruit." Matt. 7:17. Monogamy itself is not wrong, but a law that forces monogamy on society is an evil law because it produces evil results. If a tree can be judged by its fruit, then so can laws, for by their fruits ye shall know them. Ibid. v. 20. The people of Israel have always been a polygamous people, while the pagan Romans, Greeks and apostate Christians have enforced laws of monogamy. Look what monogamy has done. Why, in every generation a large percentage of our sisters has been consigned either to that nameless condition, of which it is a shame to speak, or have died without ever knowing the joys of maternity. George Q. Cannon, J.D. 2198. The law of monogamy originates from the great deceiver, and celibacy, whoredom, and divorce are usually the consequences. It is so in America. It was recently reported that by 1988, 51.5% of female teenagers ages 15 to 19 said that they had engaged in premarital sex. SL Tribune, January 15, 1991, and the percentage is even higher among the boys. The Apostle Paul said that in the latter days men would give heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils. Tim. 4:1-3. Today immorality is popular. Casual sex is taught in our schools, venereal disease has reached plague proportions, prostitution exists everywhere, immorality is a common part of movies, magazines, advertising and our social life, and these are just a few of the real immoralities promoted by the people who have made or supported laws against plural marriage because they think it is wrong. Destructions and cleansing. The evidence is clear that for many years we have lived in Babylon, but the day will come when it will be said, Babylon the Great is fallen. Rev. 18:2. The Lord will have to destroy all its wickedness to prepare for the re-establishment of his kingdom on the earth. Why does the earth need to suffer wars and destructions? It is a cleansing process. Since man has failed to honor the laws of God, they will reap their punishments. God gave the commandment to be fruitful and multiply, Gen. 1:24, but society and government now encourage small families and promote birth control and contraceptives even in public schools. God forbids whoredom, prostitution, and adultery, making laws to burn or stone the guilty parties to death. See Lev. 21:9, Num. 5:22, Gen. 38:4. But these sins, and countless more, rage in every city of our nation. God established laws against homosexuals, saying, if a man also lie with mankind, as he lieth with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination, they shall surely be put to death. Lev. 2013, but instead our government makes civil rights laws to protect them. And the list goes on and on, so is it any wonder that there will have to be drastic destructions to bring about a complete cleansing? After all these wars and destructions, the surplus of women will be even greater than before, so the question arises, how are the overplus females to obtain husbands for eternity? We will answer this question in the words of Isaiah, in that day 7 women shall take hold of one man, saying, we will eat our own bread, and wear our own apparel. Only let us be called by thy name to take away our reproach. Isaiah 4:1. Thus we see that the reproach of having no husband will be far greater than the reproach of 7 women having one husband. Indeed, the latter will be no reproach at all. It will be the only means of taking away their reproach, being a divine institution. It will be sought after with eagerness, even at the expense of eating their own bread and wearing their own apparel. The Seer, O. Pratt, page 59. Many early leaders of the church saw the gruesome fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy on this nation. Joseph said, "The United States shall present such a scene of bloodshed as is not a parallel in the history of our nation." DHC 1315, Brigham foretold, "Millions will seek to you for salvation." JD 9:143, and Heber prophesied, "Millions on millions that will come. When judgments come on the nations." JD 4:106. All this will cause the rest of Isaiah's prophecy to be fulfilled. John Taylor saw many people coming west, mostly women who were carrying small bundles on their backs, and I thought it strange that there were so few men among them. Vision of John Taylor, Visions of the Latter Days, Comp. By Kraut, page 104. Wilfred Woodruff said, "I saw the road full of people, mostly women, with just what they could carry in bundles on their backs traveling to the mountains on foot." Prophetic Years, Anderson, page 54. Newman Bulkley reported, "I saw many thousands of women and children take refuge in the timber, Hazel Rough, or any place they could conceal themselves from the turmoil that was going on the states. And when word reached this people of their situation, there were hundreds of 70s called upon to go and hunt them up and bring them to this people in Utah." He also saw senators hurled from a hull. And a great number of them were killed. Those surviving had the name of Edmonds printed on their foreheads. Visions of the Latter Days, pages 109, 110. Women who already have husbands will see the sadness and calamity of so many unfortunate single women that they will welcome their sisters into their own family, to care for them, and save them from their terrible plight. They will be the queens who will care for their subjects, thus fulfilling another prophecy by Isaiah. "I have lost my children, and am desolate, a captive, and removing to and fro. Thus saith the Lord God, Behold, I will lift up mine hand to the Gentiles, and set up my standard to the people. And they shall bring thy sons in their arms, and thy daughters shall be carried upon their shoulders. And kings shall be thy nursing fathers, and their queens thy nursing mothers. They shall bow down to thee with their face toward the earth." Isa 49:21-23. An excellent explanation of this prophecy was provided by Heber C. Kimball. Perhaps you will now refer to the Bible to prove that the time is to come when the kings of the earth will gather the saints together, and when they will bring the sons and daughters of God from afar, and when they will protect and sustain them, when the queens of the earth will have them by their sides and become nursing mothers unto them. Now, a great many suppose that this applies to the kings and queens of the various nations, but I can tell you that the kings and queens of the Gentiles will never gather the saints. And if we should wait for the rotten-hearted kings and queens of the wicked nations to gather us home, we shall have to wait a long time. Then who is to gather the people of God? You all say that we are to become a kingdom of kings and priests of queens and priestesses, and the Bible supports this doctrine. Now, the truth is, you are the very kings and priests that have got to gather the saints, and your wives have got to school them and nurse them. The scriptures say that with what measure ye mete it shall be measured to you again. We have got to gather the people, and our wives and sisters will become the nursing mothers, for they are the queens spoken of in Scripture. JD 8 348-49. And later Brother Heber mentioned this again. You elders of Israel are the very men that will have to bring the sons and daughters of Israel from afar, and nurse them at your side, and you mothers will have to take care of them when they are gathered, if you will honor your calling. JD 9:28. In his conference address in October 1901, J. Golden Kimball referred to other warning prophecies that had been uttered by his father, Heber. Whenever we transgress the laws of God, we have to suffer the penalty. I remember very accurately what my father, Heber C. Kimball, told this people in the old Bowery. Said he, "You men and you women that lift up your voices against that holy principle, plural marriage, that has been introduced among this people, the time will come when your daughters will run these streets as common harlots, and you can't help yourselves." I think some have been guilty of lifting up their voices, and if there is any one thing that some people are glad and happy it is done away with, it is that principle. I remember hearing another statement my father made. When you stand on the street corners of this great city, and you can't tell a Mormon from a Gentile, then look out for trouble. Well, it has come. The trouble has not come to us in the way of tornadoes or cyclones, but it has come to us and to our sons and daughters in the way of temptations. Conf. Rept. October 1901, page 32. Such terrible conditions of crime and apostasy within the LDS Church were also seen by John Taylor. He spoke of seeing Joseph Smith and the Savior in 1886, and among other things he said a manifesto would be adopted by the Church, following which apostasy and whoredom would be rampant in the Church. Truth Magazine 6/136. God wanted a church composed of a peculiar people rather than a popular people. He asked for the elect to be gathered out of Babylon rather than become a part of it. Plural marriage was once accepted among the Christians, but they turned against it. It was once again accepted by the Mormons, but they, too, have rejected it. By giving up the laws of God for the laws of man, we traded persecution for praise and wisdom for wealth. When the early Christians did the same, we called it apostasy. Today we call it a blessing. The polygamy paradox. The history of Mormon polygamy is indeed a paradox, a contradiction in both principle and practice. For 40 years the Church taught that the doctrine of plural and celestial marriage is the most holy and important doctrine ever revealed to man on the earth, and that without obedience to that principle, no man can ever attain to the fullness of exaltation in celestial glory. Historical Record 6/227. Now they call it apostasy and excommunicate him for it. The law and practice of plural marriage in the Mormon Church must hold a record for being the most confusing, contradictory, and misunderstood doctrine ever preached by any church, at any time, at any place. 5 years before the manifesto, one of the apostles was so convinced that the law of plural marriage should be obeyed without compromise that he said, "We should in this regard place ourselves in the same position as that of the 3 Hebrews who were cast into the fiery furnace." Heber J. Grant, Day. News, April 4, 1885. Yet shortly after this, another apostle from the opposite side of the spectrum stated, "We do not understand why the Lord commanded the practice of plural marriage." John A. Widsoe, Imp. Era 4691. Naturally it will be difficult for Christians and Mormons alike to realize why the Lord will begin his millennial kingdom on the earth with so many polygamists. They will be even further shocked when they see those who lived the principle righteously, dwelling in the kingdom of heaven. Brigham Young explained, "No religion is popular there but the religion of the Bible. Episcopalianism, Methodism, Quakerism, Catholicism, Presbyterianism, and all their collateral branches are unpopular in the celestial kingdom of God, while the religion of Adam, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the patriarchs and prophets, Jesus and his apostles, is the only acknowledged and popular system of religion, with the sanctified ones, in the presence of the Father and the Son." But, says a Presbyterian, Abraham was a polygamist. He was. And you say that his religion is popular in heaven. It is the only religion acknowledged there. J.D. 9/319. When recording his great vision of the pre-existence, Messiah Hancock began by saying, "I saw the eternal Father on his throne and his wives on his left side, all shining in glory." Hancock JRNL. Page 71. What a shock this will be for all those good Christian members who have ridiculed and persecuted polygamists for centuries. Even most Mormons will be distressed to learn that the God who gave so many laws on plural marriage actually lives those laws himself. It cannot be denied that God permitted and even commanded Old Testament prophets and apostles to live plural marriage. If it were wrong, they with all their knowledge and inspiration certainly would have been the first to disclaim it. Referring to this, even Bruce R. McConkie had to admit, We learned that the Lord frequently did command his ancient saints to practice plural marriage. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob among a host of others conformed to this ennobling and exalting principle. The whole history of ancient Israel was one in which plurality of wives was the divinely accepted and approved order of matrimony. Millions of those who entered this order have, in and through it, gained for themselves eternal exaltation in the highest heaven of the celestial world. Mormon Doctrine, 2nd ed. Page 522. At that time, as well as now, there are more worthy women than men. This same condition is apparent in both the pre-mortal and post-mortal worlds as well. Thus, plural marriage seems to be the only answer for this continuing problem. An eternal priesthood law. People who do not live plural marriage often voice strong objections and arguments against it, but they do so without any experience. This is similar to the person who argues against Christianity without ever opening a Bible or entering a chapel. But in a religious sense, plural marriage did not originate with man, but with God, who is the only one who can see clearly the eternal picture of mankind, and why obedience to this principle, ordinance, covenant, and law is so important. In reality, it provides another opportunity for God to bless his saints in the following ways. Temporal blessings. 1. It gives all women a chance to have a husband and children, and a better husband at that. 2. Barren women can have the joy and satisfaction of still being a mother in Israel by being a mother to her sister wives' children. 3. It encourages fidelity to one's spouse rather than promiscuity, fornication, adultery, etc. 4. It provides another helping hand in a man's earthly kingdom at home and at work. 5. A man has a greater source of counsel from several wives rather than just one. 6. It provides a man with greater experience in handling a variety of women, preparing him for eternal marriages. 7. With a division of responsibility, wives have more free time for their own personal interests. 8. Each wife will usually put forth her best conduct and appearance in order to please her husband. 9. While one or more wives pursue activities outside the home, their children can be well taken care of by those wives who prefer to stay at home. 10. Economically, should wives desire to live together, one home is cheaper to maintain than two. Spiritual blessings. 1. Celestial plural marriage comes with the conditional promise of an eternal marriage relationship as gods and goddesses. 2. As such, it provides the opportunity of having your own spirit children. 3. Such individuals will receive exaltation and associate with other gods and goddesses forever. There are reasons for every principle, ordinance, covenant, and law that God has given. We may not always see the reasons, nor will obedience always be easy, but they all have their purpose. The prophet Joseph stated, And as God has designed our happiness and the happiness of all his creatures, he never will institute an ordinance or give a commandment to his people that is not calculated in its nature to promote that happiness which he has designed, and which will not end in the greatest amount of good and glory to those who become the recipients of his law and ordinances. TPJS, pages 256-57. Celestial plural marriage, then, should be recognized as an eternal law of the priesthood, a command of God for the well-being, happiness and exaltation of his elect, who will eventually rejoice in this blessing of the holy priesthood.